Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.
Good afternoon. Can I remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the Chamber and across the Holyrood campus. I ask members to take care to observe these measures, including when entering and exiting the Chamber. Please only use the aisles and walkways to access your seat or when moving about the Chamber. The first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions, and the portfolio today is health and social care. Can I ask members who wish to request a supplementary question, they should put press their request to speak buttons or put an R in the chat function if they're joining us remotely during the relevant question. And I call question number 1, Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on NHS Highland's independent review into allegations of staff bullying in Argyll and Bute.
Cabinet Secretary.
Many improvement actions have already been delivered in response to the independent review of culture in Argyll and Bute, and that was recommended by John Sturrock QC in his review into cultural issues in NHS Highland. NHS Highland have reported that there has been significant discussion at the board and within health and social care partnerships to explore how they may work together to support staff from across both health and social care who have experienced bullying. The leadership team has held a number of staff engagement events to tell staff about the actions taken and listen to staff feedback. The actions include an independent helpline for staff to discuss concerns, an independent review of disciplinary, grievance, bullying and harassment procedures, a wider rollout of the Courageous Conversations programme, a monthly assurance panel to review hiring decisions and to build trust. The Scottish Government continues to support NHS Highland as it takes forward actions in response to this report, the report by John Sturrock QC and the recent independent listening and hearing survey.
Thank you. Donald Cameron.
I'm very grateful for that update from the Cabinet Secretary. He may be aware that there were calls in the last session of the Scottish Parliament to hold a debate on the findings in the Sturrock report. And the First Minister herself said she was broadly sympathetic to this. Will he commit to holding a debate in government time on this important issue so that victims of bullying across the NHS, wherever they are in Scotland, feel that they are being listened to and that we do not abandon them?
Cabinet Secretary.
So first and foremost, can I thank Donald Cameron for raising this issue. I should also mention that Emma Roddick MSP, Edward Mountain MSP have raised these issues, and they're incredibly important issues that the government takes seriously. And I suspect for all of our political differences, we are united on the fact that there should be a zero-tolerance approach to any bullying and harassment anywhere in the workplace, let alone within our NHS and social care. What I would say about a debate, that hasn't been ruled out, but he knows that we are currently in the midst of a global pandemic. He would have heard the priorities from the programme for government yesterday. That will be our immediate focus in terms of parliamentary debates. I wouldn't rule it out in the future. I do also note that the Conservative Party, I think, have opposition debate next week, so they, of course, could also bring that debate forward if they so choose to do so. And if they did, then, of course, I would respond on behalf of the government.
Thank you. Question number 2, David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what importance it places on recognising and addressing the societal issues that contribute to poor mental health.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Poverty is the single biggest driver of poor mental health, and that is why we continue to urge the UK Government to reverse their decision on cutting the uplift of universal credit. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing structural inequality in our society, and that the adverse impacts on mental health are felt disproportionately by disadvantaged groups. In our Mental Health Transition and Recovery Plan, we have committed to making the mental health of these groups a priority. We also know that other social determinants, including employment and debt, can impact on mental health and well-being. And we are working with employers, trade unions and other organisations, including the Money and Pension Service and Citizens Advice Scotland, to better understand and tackle these issues.
Thank you. David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The recent survey carried out by the Medical and Dental Defence Union of Scotland showed that 47% of its Scottish GP members and 58% of dentist members reporting higher levels of stress because of the pandemic. Can I ask the Minister what measures have been put in place to support the mental health of all NHS staff?
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Our recovery plan, published on the 25th of August, outlines that recovery of staff is intrinsic to our collective ambitions for renewing our NHS. The Government is providing £8 million this financial year to support the mental health and well-being of the health and social care workforce. This includes targeted support to the primary care and social care workforces of £2 million. And a range of national resources are available to support the mental health and well-being of those working in health and social care. That includes the National Wellbeing Hub, which provides self-care and digital resources, the National Wellbeing Helpline, which provides a 24/7 service to those who require psychological support and can offer advice, signposting and onward referral to local services where required. We also have Coaching for Wellbeing, a free-to-access digital coaching service, and we have the Workforce Specialist Service as well. And additional capacity within boards has been put in place to provide psychological therapies and interventions to support staff's mental health.
Thank you, Minister. I've got a number of supplementaries. I want to take all of them, so I'll need brief questions and brief answers, Minister. Firstly, Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary for Health conceded yesterday that waiting times for child and adolescent mental health services are, and I quote, unacceptable, and he admitted that the targets were being badly missed before the pandemic. We found out this week that CAM's We found out this week that CAM referral rates are now the highest on record, with 1 in every 100 children being referred for specialist care. So will the Minister now outline what he intends to do to honour its commitment, the Government's commitment, to increase the CAM's workforce by 320 new staff?
As briefly as possible, Minister.
Well, first of all, I would outline to Mr Hoy that since this Government came to power, the CAM's workforce has risen by some 80%. And we will continue to ensure that we do our level best to reduce the waiting times and to do what is required to improve services for those in need. What would be helpful in all of this is if we didn't have that continued austerity agenda, so we could employ even more staff. And what I would say to Mr Hoy and to his Conservative colleagues is to try and persuade the UK Government to reverse their austerity policies so that we can invest even more in our public services here in Scotland.
Thank you, Minister. Alex Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The reality is that societal issues such as poverty have a major impact on children and adolescents. So the waiting times in Fife for CAMS are at an unacceptable level and rising. Will the Minister agree to meet with me so that we can have a discussion on these issues and see what the Scottish Government can do to support Fife NHS try and get these waiting times down?
Thank you. Briefly, Minister.
As always, Presiding Officer, I'm more than happy to meet with Mr Rowley to discuss this or any other issues. I recognise that there is a difficulty in Fife. As members will know, I've spoken to a number of health boards around about actions that I feel that they need to take to improve services further. We have given some £29 million of additional support to bring CAMS waiting lists down. But as I say, I'm more than happy to discuss these issues further with Mr Rowley in a constructive manner.
Thank you, Minister. And Willie Rennie.
The Minister listed a lot of contributors to poor mental health, but I didn't hear him mention the fact that we've got enormous long lists and the contribution that that makes to the worsening mental health in this country. If people have to wait up to 2 years to get treatment, it is no surprise that their mental health does not improve. Is he going to do something about it at last?
Minister.
Well, we have laid out what we're going to do in terms of our action plans. I am determined, the Government is determined, to ensure that the additional resources that we have put in play are used effectively to do the best for the people of this country, particularly the young folk who are waiting on treatment.
Thank you. Now, question number 3, Gillian Mackay.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what the average waiting time is for cataract surgery.
Cabinet Secretary.
Public Health Scotland published the most recent stage of treatment data on the 31st of August. It showed that the median wait during the quarter ending the 30th of June 2021 for ophthalmology treatment was 52 days. Over half, 54% of those waiting for ophthalmology treatment had been waiting 9 weeks or less. The Scottish Government does not hold subspeciality information which would cover cataract procedures. We recognise that a backlog of care has emerged during the pandemic as a result of services being paused. However, cataract procedures have still continued during this challenging time. To support this, the Scottish Government has made £1.75 million available to NHS Golden Jubilee to support additional cataract procedures this financial year.
Gillian Mackay.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and obviously all of this is with the pandemic as a backdrop. I've been contacted by a constituent who's been advised by NHS Lanarkshire that she will have to wait at least 70 weeks for cataract surgery unless she pays for private health care. My constituent's eyesight is deteriorating rapidly and she's terrified that she will soon be unable to drive or perform her duties as a teacher. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise what support the Government can provide to NHS Lanarkshire to help reduce its waiting time for cataract surgery?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can. I share Gillian Mackay's concern. I know she has corresponded with me, but what I would ask Gillian Mackay to do, if she can provide the details of the constituent, I know she's corresponded in the general, but if she could give details of the specific constituent, then I'm more than happy for that case to be investigated, because like her, I would have also nervousness about somebody having to wait 70 weeks for a cataract operation. We are giving additional funding to the Golden Jubilee. They plan on delivering 12,000 cataract surgeries in core sessions this financial year. That's 4,000 more than they delivered the previous year. But we know that there is a significant backlog across all procedures, and that's why we published our NHS recovery plan at the end of last month.
Brief supplementary, Annie Miles.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I was trying to go too fast there, I tripped up. Across my own health board, with our heroic frontline staff under unprecedented pressure, we are seeing cancellations of elective surgery appointments, leaving thousands to wait in pain before they can get the surgery they need. This is having a brutal knock-on effect on A&E, being the 4th week in a row where waiting times have hit the worst level on record. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what reassurances can be given to staff, and when will a winter preparedness plan be published?
Cabinet Secretary.
Sorry, I didn't catch the very end of that question, but what I would say to Annie Wells is we take that significant challenge extremely seriously. As the Secretary of State no doubt does in England, as health ministers do in Wales and Northern Ireland, where we are facing this collective challenge that has been exacerbated, extremely significantly exacerbated by the effects of the pandemic. So our recovery plan, which of course is backed by £1 billion worth of investment, goes into significant detail about how we'll increase inpatient activity by 20% actually of the lifetime of this Parliament, outpatient by 10%, diagnostics significantly by over 70,000 by 22-23. And it's detailed in there. I'm more than happy to meet the member, but these are to discuss that in more detail. These are challenging decisions that health boards are making, and of course we will continue to fund them and give them the investment they need, but also take care of our staff's mental and physical well-being because they are crucial to help us to meet those targets in our recovery plan.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I know we've got supplementaries for most of the rest of the questions. I want to get those supplementaries in, so I would appreciate brief questions and, Minister Cabinet Secretary, brief answers. Question number 4, Meghan Gallacher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it last met with the National Autistic Society in light of its reported concerns regarding support for families during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I fully recognise the incredible pressure that the pandemic has had on autistic children, their families and carers. The Scottish Government meets with the National Autistic Society regularly. Officials last met with NAS on the 23rd of August, and I will meet with the Director of NAS shortly. The Scottish Government has provided significant additional funding to help meet those pressures, including £170,000 to national autism charities, £28.5 million for local carer support, and a further £1.1 million last year to the voluntary sector short break funds. We also published our Towards Transformation plan in March.
Meghan Gallacher.
The Director of the National Autistic Society Scotland has warned that the pandemic has removed critical support for families which have left carers and young people struggling. Homeschooling was difficult for children with autism to adjust to, with statistics showing that 63% of autistic young people missed attending school. In addition, figures from the Autism Centre for Education also revealed uncertainty around education, which caused high levels of stress and anxiety. What progress has been made on the Learning Disability, Autism and Neurodiversity Bill, and when will families and people with autism receive the help and support they deserve?
Minister Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Families will continue to receive the support, some of which I've already outlined. And as I say, I'm sure that some of this will form part of the discussion that I have with the Director of NAS when we meet shortly. I should say that the Scottish Government, in terms of the bill and the Learning Disability and Autism Commissioner, we will carry out the scoping work for all of that, the remit and powers, very soon within this parliamentary year, and following the successful passage of a Learning Disability, Autism and Neurodiversity Bill, a Commissioner will be appointed as soon as possible. I know that there are some very diverse views around about how we should move this forward, and I aim to talk to as many stakeholders as possible around about that so that we get this scoping work and remit and powers right.
Thank you. Supplementary, Fiona Hislop.
Can the Minister set out what action is being taken to support young children who are effective in masking or hiding their autism, causing delays in receiving a timely diagnosis in their early years of education? Specifically, what action is being taken to support young girls who are more likely to mask their symptoms, and how will they adapt pre-pandemic plans to do more to work with the affected families to focus on identifying and supporting these children?
As briefly as possible, Minister.
Thank you. I'll start by saying to Ms Hislop, I'll write to her because there's a lot of work going on here. But very briefly, new guidance commissioned by the Scottish Government and published by the National Autism Implementation Team in May this year supports areas to develop local children's neurodevelopmental pathways. We know that there are challenges in diagnosis, particularly with young females who are able to mask the condition. We will do more in terms of developing the guidance to get this absolutely right. And as I say, this is a complex area. I will write to Ms Hislop in some depth and any other member who requires that information.
Thank you, Minister. Question number 5, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what support is available to dental practices to alleviate pressures specifically related to COVID-19.
Minister Marie Todd, who joins us remotely.
The Scottish Government is fully committed to supporting the NHS dental sector, which is why from the beginning of the pandemic we have put in place emergency support payments for NHS practices and dentists, which includes 33 million of additional funding per year. We've also recently announced 7.5 million of funding for dentists to buy new equipment to help reduce the impact of UK-wide COVID restrictions. This builds on the 5 million that we have already provided to the sector for ventilation improvements. National procurement continues to provide around 1.5 million of PPE per week free of charge to dental contractors providing NHS care, and we expect these measures to increase the productivity of practices, enabling them to see more patients within the current infection prevention and control constraints.
Okay.
I thank the Minister for that. In my constituency, Plain Street Dental Practice has the responsibility for 6,000 patients, yet due to funding structures in place for COVID support, when one dentist left during the pandemic, the practice lost 25% funding, despite patient numbers remaining the same. Balancing reduced staff and physical distancing while ensuring dental care for thousands of patients places increasing demand on practices. Would the Scottish Government agree that this anomaly is unfair on practices in such situations, and will the Government commit to evaluating how this policy can be adapted to ensure proportionate funding is maintained?
Minister Marie-Todd.
I thank the member for that question. We're certainly interested in working with dental practices to ensure that they are financially sustainable going forward. Our commitment and programme for government to providing free dental care shows absolutely the priority that we give to dental care for the population. We've provided significant funding for contractors who provide NHS dental services. Dentists have received a top-up payment of 80% of their average monthly earnings from 2019 to 20, and from November 2020 we increased that to 85%, and that remains in place. More than happy to hear more details of the situation in the that the member raises in his own constituency. If you could write to me, I can certainly look into that particular situation and give him a fuller, more individual response.
Thank you. Brief supplementary. Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. With dental practices across Scotland currently operating at restricted capacity in line with those COVID restrictions, there have been worrying reports that while NHS patients are having to wait months to see a dentist, those who can afford to go private are being seen within days. Is the Minister not concerned we're seeing the development of a two-tier dental system in Scotland? And what steps will be taken to ensure that NHS patients who cannot afford private dental care still receive timely treatment which they need and are entitled to?
Minister Marie-Todd.
I thank the member for that question. We're absolutely committed to NHS dental care, and we're absolutely committed to supporting and protecting NHS dental care for all patients in Scotland. And by the end of this term of Parliament, everyone in Scotland will be able to access free NHS dental care. There are particular challenges for the dental sector because of COVID, because the majority of procedures involve aerosol generating procedures. So we have put in place funding to support enhanced ventilation in NHS practices, and we have also put in funding to support different types of handheld instruments which are less likely, which don't generate aerosols. So we're doing what we can within the constraints of the pandemic to increase capacity for NHS dental care, and our commitment to NHS dental care is absolutely fundamentally very strong.
Question number 6, Pam Gosal.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it's taking to address the reported backlog of the NHS operations.
Cabinet Secretary.
We published our NHS recovery plan on the 25th of August. It outlines our ambitions of increasing NHS capacity by at least 10% as quickly as possible in order to address the backlog and meet the ongoing healthcare needs for people across the country. That is, of course, backed by £1 billion of additional Scottish Government investment. For this year alone, we've made more than £80 million available to support health boards, specifically to target the backlog of treatment and care. However, we need to remember that the pandemic is not over and that COVID-19 and other pressures will impact on the NHS for some time to come. Health boards' elective activity is being monitored through daily and weekly returns to the Scottish Government and support provided where required.
Pam Gosal.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the answer. We have ambulances queuing out the door of A&Es. Record waiting times all of which putting patients' lives at risk. In my own region, I have constituents reported a stroke, a heart attack. In one example, an ambulance...
We need a question, Ms Gothel.
Sorry, one ambulance was called at 2:30 and came at 4:45 next morning. I contacted you about this, Cabinet Minister, and I'm still waiting for a response, and that's been over a month. Can I therefore ask the Cabinet Secretary how he can help patients like my constituents get the help and support they need from the paramedics who are desperate to deliver it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I first start by thanking the ambulance service for the incredible work they're doing when they're facing such significant pressures, pandemic pressures that have built up the demand that Pam Gosel and that all of us are seeing in the constituencies and regions that we represent. So for the ambulance service specifically, we've given an additional £20 million. That was already invested, and now we're starting to see recruitment come on board. In fact, last week, additional recruitment of 60-odd paramedics and ambulance staff into the north and north-east of the country. We'll back that by £1 billion of additional investment. That will help to increase our capacity. But what we won't do is, when it comes to that additional £1 billion to aid our recovery, which is, by the way, £400 million more than the Conservatives were looking to spend, what we won't do is we won't hammer the lowest paid in order to pay for that recovery. We'll make sure that that recovery, that additional investment that we bring forward, doesn't hit those who have already been hit hardest by the pandemic.
Question 7, Finlay Carson.
To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to support rural health services following the end of COVID-19 pandemic.
Cabinet Secretary.
Our NHS recovery plan sets out key ambitions and actions to be developed and delivered now and over the next 5 years, and that includes in rural areas. The recovery plan, as I say, is being backed by £1 billion of targeted investment. The Scottish Government remains committed to the recommendations set out in Sir Lewis Ritchie's Shaping the Future Together Remote and Rural General Practice Working Group report, which aims to enhance primary care across remote, rural and island communities by ensuring stability for rural GP incomes, alongside other measures that support innovative approaches to the use of IT and physical infrastructure, as well as, of course, supporting recruitment and retention practices in rural areas. Following the 2021 Scottish Parliamentary elections, the recommendation to create a Centre for Excellence for Rural and Remote Medicine is now a Scottish Government manifesto commitment that we will deliver in this Parliament.
Finlay Carson.
Yesterday it was revealed that more than 1,600 children have been waiting over a year for mental health support. Alarmingly, in my constituency, nearly 2/3 of young people seeking help have not been seen within the 18-week NHS target time. This is absolutely shameful. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me. It's a lost generation of vulnerable children and young people, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. Despite promises from the Scottish Government, services still remain
under-resourced. Question, Mr Carson.
Can I ask when the Government will finally act and provide adequate and timely support for my constituents?
Cabinet Secretary.
We are acting, as my colleague Kevin Stewart outlined in a previous question, an 80% increase in CAM staff under this Government, increased spending on mental health promised by this Government, £1 billion of additional spending in the recovery plan by this Government, a 320 increase in CAM's staff. So where there are specific issues in rural areas, I'm of course happy to work with the member to help to address those, but I would give him an absolute and categorical assurance that the mental health, particularly of our children and young people, is a Government priority.
Before inviting question 8, earlier in this session I did ask members to be brief in their questions and ministers to be equally brief in their responses. I think we have not seen any evidence of that this afternoon, and therefore I'm going to have to consider how we go about trying to trim this back. We've got 3 supplementaries on this question alone, none of which we'll be able to take. So question 8, Mercedes Villalba, please.
To ask the Scottish Government what steps it's taking to ensure that patients and staff at Old Aberdeen Medical Practice are consulted on the future provision of its GP services.
Cabinet Secretary.
Patient safety is absolute paramount in any changes to service provision. Integration authorities are legally required to engage and consult with staff, but also crucially patients, to ensure the best outcomes for local communities. Aberdeen City Partnership have extensively engaged with staff in the proposed changes and communicated their plans to patients, assuring them that they will continue to receive medical care at the practice.
Mercedes Villalba.
I thank the Minister for his response. Until recently, Old Aberdeen Medical Practice was publicly run and it served the community well. I've met with campaigners who are angry about the way it's been put out to tender, and the previous Minister ignored requests to intervene. So will the Cabinet Secretary agree to meet with the campaigners to hear their concerns?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'll, of course, absolutely consider that request. I would say that it is often from the Labour benches that we are told that government interferes and intervenes too much when it comes to local decision-making. These are local decisions to be made by local integration authorities. Now you are asking, of course, for central government to now intervene and interfere in that decision-making against the best judgment of the integration authority. But I will, of course, if Ms Villalba writes to me, I will, of course, consider meeting her and indeed campaigners about what I know is an important local issue.
Thank you. There will be a brief interlude before we move to the next item of business.
Thank you. Can I remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the Chamber and across the Holyrood campus, and I ask that members take care to observe these measures, including when entering and exiting the Chamber. Please only use the aisles and walkways to access your seat and when moving around the Chamber. The next item of business is a statement by Nicola Sturgeon on COVID-19 update. The First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Nicola Sturgeon. First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'll give a detailed update today on the Scottish Government's most recent assessment of the state of the pandemic and also on the progress with vaccination. I'll also outline the latest position on 3 specific vaccination-related matters on which there has been significant development in the past week, namely ongoing consideration of possible vaccination of all 12 to 15-year-olds, the JCVI recommendation for booster vaccination of those who are immunosuppressed, and our proposal, to be debated by Parliament tomorrow, of course, for a limited and targeted system of vaccine certification. Firstly, though, I will summarise today's statistics, which have been published in the last half hour or so. 5,810 positive cases were reported yesterday, 10.8% of all the tests that were carried out. 883 people are currently in hospital with COVID, which is 78 more than yesterday, and 82 people are receiving intensive care, which is 5 more than yesterday. Sadly, I have to report a further 17 deaths that were reported in the past 24 hours, and that takes the total number of deaths registered under this daily definition to 8,198. And as always, my sincerest condolences are with everyone who has lost a loved one. These figures show clearly that we are still experiencing a surge in cases and indeed a very high level of infection within the population. However, the latest data also gives us some early, albeit tentative at this stage, indication that the rate of increase may now be slowing down. That can be seen from an analysis of the last 3 weeks of case numbers. In the week to 22nd August, based on the date test samples were taken, an average of 3,374 new cases per day were recorded. In the week to 29th August, that had risen to an average of 5,763 cases a day, an increase of more than 70%. However, figures for the most recent week, which is up to the 5th of September, show a daily average of 6,304, an increase of 9%. The 7-day average test positivity by specimen date has also fallen back slightly from a peak of 13.4% on the 29th of August to 12.7% as at 5th September. It's also worth perhaps providing a bit more detail about the age breakdown of the latest case figures. Over the past week, 75% of all cases have been in those aged under 45, and that is consistent with the broad picture that we've seen throughout this current wave of infection. However, further analysis of the under 45s shows variation between different age bands and also gives scope for some very cautious optimism. For example, in the most recent week, the number of cases in the 0 to 14-year-old age band has risen by 44%. Now, while that is a significant increase, it does represent a significant slowing in the rate of increase from the previous week, when cases in that age group increased by more than 150%. Cases in the 25 to 44-year-old age band have also continued to rise, but again the rate of increase has slowed quite considerably. It was 6% in the most recent week compared to almost 70% in the week before. And amongst 15 to 24-year-olds, cases have actually fallen in the most recent week by 18%, from just under 11,000 to just under 9,000. And that fall of around 18% compares to an increase in that age group of 29% in the previous week. So we can take from all of that that it appears that the rate of increase has slowed. And that may well suggest that the appeal to individuals and businesses over the past 2 weeks to improve compliance with basic mitigations and for all of us to be more cautious in our everyday behaviours is having some impact. The ongoing work of Test and Protect is also vital and hugely appreciated. I want to take the opportunity now to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone for all of the considerable efforts and sacrifices that continue to be made, but also to issue a strong and equally heartfelt appeal to please keep it up. The data I have just reported, showing what seems to be a slowing in the rate of increase in new cases, does give us more cause for cautious optimism than we've had for a few weeks. But, and I'm afraid this is always the hard part, cases are still rising week on week, and they are currently at their highest levels since the start of the pandemic. Of course, part of this reflects the significantly higher number of tests being conducted now compared to earlier stages of the pandemic, and indeed compared to other parts of the UK. Testing rates per head of population in Scotland recently for both PCR and LFD tests have been significantly higher than in England and Wales. However, this is reflective of the fact that since around the time of our schools returning, our levels of infection have also been higher. And that is the key fundamental point. The levels of infection across the country, albeit that we may be seeing some potential and very welcome signs of stabilisation now, remain far too high. So that's why we must continue to monitor the situation very closely and be prepared, as any responsible government must be, to take any targeted and proportionate action that we consider necessary to keep the country as safe as possible. Keeping the country as safe as possible means, of course, doing everything we can to protect against serious illness and death. But it also means protecting the ability of our NHS and those who work so hard in it to not just care for COVID patients, which they do with such skill and compassion, but also to catch up on backlogs and give care to everyone who needs it for whatever reason. As I have narrated many times before, vaccination has significantly reduced the link between cases of COVID and serious health harm from COVID, and that continues to be true. The proportion of people with the virus who end up in hospital is much lower now than it was before the vaccination programme started, and that continues to be hugely positive and reassuring. But our current case numbers reflect the fact that the Delta variant is significantly more transmissible than previous strains. And just as much as vaccines have been in a very good way, Delta has been a game changer in a very bad way. And so, of course, even a much lower percentage of a very high number of cases will, indeed already is, put intense pressure on the National Health Service. And we can see the evidence of that very clearly in the latest data on hospital and intensive care admissions and occupancy, though we must remember that there is a time lag between case numbers and hospital admissions. It always takes a week or so before any improvement in the number of cases feeds through into hospital data. But in the 7 days up to last Friday, 785 people with COVID were admitted to hospital, and that's an increase of almost 50% from the week before, when 530 people were admitted. As a result, hospital occupancy has also risen sharply. On Friday, 20th of August, there were 312 people in hospital with COVID. Today, there are 883. The number of people in intensive care has also increased, albeit at a slower rate, but increased from 34 on 20th of August to 82 today. And of course, it's worth pointing out, as we always do, that these figures don't include other forms of serious illness. For example, people who don't require hospital treatment but suffer long COVID. So that inescapable fact remains. If we don't see the rate of increase slow further and then fall, many more people will become seriously ill, and sadly some of them will die. And the NHS will come under pressure even more severe than it is already dealing with. And the pressure it is already dealing with, and this point simply cannot be overstated, is already very severe. So we must not let up in our efforts to stem this current wave of cases. We continue to hope, and indeed, as I have just been outlining, recent data gives us a bit more of a solid basis for this hope, that we can turn the corner through continued care and caution and stringent compliance with existing mitigations, and without having to reintroduce any tighter restrictions. But to do that, as has been the case right throughout this whole experience, we need the help of every business and every individual across the country. We need everyone to continue to stick to the basic mitigations that we know are effective in helping to slow down transmission. Last week, Cabinet Secretaries engaged intensively with a range of representatives from business, the public sector and wider civic society. They discussed how all of us, government, employers and the wider public, must play our full part in observing and encouraging maximum compliance with current mitigations. These, of course, include the wearing of face coverings, stringent hygiene, good ventilation and support for continued home working wherever possible. And I am once again very grateful to everyone, including businesses, for everything that is being done to follow and promote these measures. This is making a difference, and while we can't rule anything out completely, it is also reducing the likelihood of restrictions having to be reintroduced. The Government will also, of course, continue to do everything we can to encourage compliance, for example, through continued support for Test and Protect, ongoing investment in ventilation and carbon dioxide monitors in schools, and the provision of public information and advice. We're also continuing to do everything possible to maximise vaccine uptake, both in the groups already eligible and through a readiness for quick implementation of any advice on the extension of vaccine eligibility. Getting vaccinated as soon as we are able remains the single most important thing any of us can do to protect ourselves and others. As of today, I can report that 4,130,841 people have had a first dose and 3,749,767 have now had both doses. That includes 95% of people over 40 who are now fully vaccinated, as well as 72% of 30 to 39-year-olds and 57% of 18 to 29-year-olds. Three-quarters of 18 to 29-year-olds, though, have had their first dose, so the proportion in the age group, that age group who become fully vaccinated will continue to increase in light, of course, of that 8-week gap between doses. In addition, 60% of 16 and 17-year-olds have had the first JAG already, and that is 10 percentage points higher than I reported this time last week. We'll continue to do everything we can to encourage more and more people to get their JAG. For example, just in the last fortnight, we've written to all 16 and 17-year-olds who haven't been vaccinated yet to offer appointments, though of course they can also attend a drop-in clinic, and we're ensuring that mobile vaccination units are deployed during university and college freshers' weeks. Presiding Officer, in addition to that report on progress with the current vaccine programme, I also want to briefly update Parliament on recent advice from the JCVI on possible extensions of the programme. On Friday, the JCVI updated its analysis on offering vaccination to all 12 to 15-year-olds. The JCVI has concluded that the health benefit of vaccination for 12 to 15-year-olds does marginally outweigh any risks, but because it considers children to be at relatively lower risk of serious health harm from the virus, it has decided at this stage not to recommend that vaccination is offered to all 12 to 15-year-olds. However, and significantly, the JCVI also acknowledged that it would be appropriate for governments in coming to a policy decision to consider any wider benefits of vaccination, for example, whether vaccinating that age group could reduce any further disruption to education. Therefore, the 4 UK governments have asked our Chief Medical Officers to undertake a rapid assessment of the latest evidence and provide advice on wider benefits. We expect to receive this advice soon, I hope within days, and the Scottish Government stands ready to act in accordance with any recommendations that we receive. Last week, the JCVI also issued advice to the effect that people with certain health conditions that suppress their immune systems should now be offered a third dose of vaccine. This is because 2 doses may not be sufficient to enable those with compromised immune systems to mount a full immune response to COVID. We are now moving to implement this advice over the next few weeks, and we will provide further information to those affected by this advice shortly. We still await and hope to receive it very soon, the JCVI's final advice on a more general booster programme, and again we stand ready to implement that as soon as the recommendation is available. The third point I want to touch on relates to vaccine certification. Parliament, of course, will debate and vote tomorrow on the principle of a limited, targeted and proportionate system of certification as an alternative to the risk of further periods of closure for higher risk settings. Ahead of that debate and to inform it, we will publish a paper setting out in broad terms how the scheme will operate and detailing the work we are doing in consultation with business to finalise the detail and produce sector-specific guidance. As we debate this, though, it is important to bear in mind that Scotland is far from alone in considering such a scheme. Indeed, COVID certification has already been introduced by several other governments of different political persuasions in countries right across Europe. Indeed, many countries have already gone much further than the Scottish Government is proposing. Indeed, COVID certification is becoming an increasingly common response to the exceptional circumstances we are all facing at this stage of the pandemic. The simple fact is that neither we nor any other country has the luxury of doing nothing to keep COVID under control. The question, especially after 18 months of restrictions being in place to varying degrees, is how we do so in the most proportionate and least restrictive way possible. In the Scottish Government's view, COVID certification is a reasonable response to a very difficult situation and a much more proportionate response than any of the likely alternatives. Fundamentally, we believe that certification can help us reduce the overall harms caused by the pandemic. It will not eradicate transmission completely, but it will help to reduce it in some higher risk settings, and it will also maximise protection against serious illness. And we believe, as has been seen already in some other countries, perhaps most notably in France, it will help encourage take-up of the vaccine. It also represents a targeted way in which we can, we hope, enable certain events and venues to continue to operate at times when rates of COVID may be high and even rising. Now, the time I have devoted today again to vaccination reflects the fact that it remains absolutely key to our progress out of this pandemic, not just here in Scotland, but across the world. For each of us as individuals, getting vaccinated remains the single most important step that any of us can take to keep ourselves safe, to keep others safe, and to reduce the need for any restrictions to be reintroduced. However, while the most important, getting vaccinated is not the only step that all of us need to take right now, and so I will close by stressing the 3 key things that each of us can do as we all play our part in getting cases back under control. The first of these, as I have stressed already and as I will keep stressing, is to get vaccinated if you are eligible. If you haven't been vaccinated yet, or if you have had your first dose 8 or more weeks ago and haven't had a second dose yet, please get your JAG. It's straightforward to do. There are drop-in centres in every mainland health board area, or you can book an appointment. Second, please continue to test yourself regularly with lateral flow devices. You can order these free through the NHS Inform website or collect them from a local test site or pharmacy. The point of regular testing is this, and it really matters. If you have the virus, but you aren't aware of that because you're not displaying any symptoms, taking a test gives you a chance of finding out that you have the virus before you inadvertently pass it on to others. So regular testing is a key and really important way in interrupting chains of transmission. Of course, if you test positive through one of these lateral flow devices, or if you are identified as a close contact, or if you have symptoms of the virus, make sure that you self-isolate and book a PCR test. And thirdly and finally, please continue to follow all of the remaining rules and guidelines that are still in place. For example, it is still a legal requirement to wear face coverings in indoor public places like shops, public transport, and when entering and moving about hospitality settings. Face coverings are a simple but important and effective way in which we can help protect each other. More generally, continue to think carefully about the number of contacts you're having and perhaps reduce any that are not really necessary. Meet outdoors as much as possible. If you're indoors, open the windows. Good ventilation makes a big difference. And even though it's not the law anymore, try to keep a safe distance from people in other households if you can, especially when you're indoors. In addition, try to minimise physical contact like handshaking for the time being, and wash your hands and surfaces regularly and thoroughly. Having to take these steps is frustrating, but we know they do make a difference and they help to limit the spread of COVID. Indeed, as I said earlier, it may well be that we are seeing the evidence of the difference these measures make in our most recent data. So let me end by again thanking everyone who is helping us to turn the corner in this latest wave of the virus. Please keep these efforts up so that we can continue to keep each other as safe as possible.
Thank you. The First Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 40 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. And it would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. COVID cases remain high, and therefore it's vital that our test and protect system is operating at the top of its game. But we know this is a system that continues to be overwhelmed. Provisional figures for this week show that just over half of cases are being traced. And this follows reports that contact tracers are being advised not to repeatedly call positive COVID patients if they can't get through to them. Our NHS is struggling to cope as well. This week's A&E waiting times are at the worst levels since current records began. We're consistently hearing of dire waits for people looking to get an ambulance and people unable to see their GPs. The SNP don't seem ready to support the NHS this autumn, let alone into the winter, when we know the problems will get even more acute. We'd really need to hear from the First Minister a proper plan to deal with these issues, not the PR flimsy pamphlet that the SNP government produced earlier on this year. And we're also seeing the same problems on vaccine passports. The First Minister's just promised a paper, but publishing it just hours before Parliament is expected to vote on vaccine passports is not good enough. So far, there is no details and no answers to the SNP's plans. We wanted to look at the content of the First Minister's proposals, but quite frankly, there is nothing to scrutinise. Even the promised paper in the First Minister's statement is talking about how they're going to finalise the proposal rather than how the scheme will actually operate. It will only set out, and I quote the First Minister's words, in broad terms how the scheme will operate. First Minister, broad terms is not acceptable for an issue of such importance that you want MSPs to support in just 24 hours' time. We need specifics, but we don't have them. We don't know how the scheme will be administered or enforced. We don't know if the data concerns have been fixed. We don't know if fraud risks have even been identified. We don't know what infrastructure will be needed. We don't know if the SNP will rule out extending them indefinitely or rolling them out to further venues at short notice. We've been asking these questions for a week now and have received no answers. This is clearly a last-minute rush job, and the more businesses hear about the proposals, the more they agree they are an absolute shambles. Back her plans if they don't know what they are.
First Minister, would you like Mr Ross to repeat the end of that question? I think
if he was here.
I think, Mr Ross, could I just ask if you could repeat the end of your question? Thank you.
Of course, thank you, Presiding Officer. I was asking, can the First Minister provide details on her scheme now? And if not, how does she expect the public to back her plans if they don't know what they are?
First Minister.
Well, let me take Test and Protect, Accident Emergency and Vaccine certification in turn. Firstly, on Test and Protect, Douglas Ross has quoted figures today, as was done by others last week, that frankly do a real disservice to those working in Test and Protect. The publication that he has quoted, which cites provisional figures, actually tells you why it's not reliable to quote provisional figures, because the contact tracing is ongoing, and therefore it is the following week, when the figures are finalised, that are the ones that matter. So if you take the provisional figures last week, and I think it was Jackie Bailey that quoted these last week, the provisional figure for completed cases was 43%. It's up to, I think, 55% this week. But that 43% that was quoted last week to do down Test and Protect, in the finalised figure this week is 82%. So it is doing a real disservice for politicians who perfectly legitimately want to have a go at me and this government. In doing so, they are doing down the efforts of those working in Test and Protect. And the provisional figures for Test and Protect this week show, and again I stress, these are provisional figures, they will be updated and finalised next week, but in this week's provisional figures, 89% of cases close within the 72-hour target, the WHO target of 80% within 72 hours, 89% in the provisional figure this week, up from 85.5% in the provisional figures last week. So this is an organisation that, yes, is under pressure. How could it be otherwise with the pandemic and the level of infection right now? But it's an organisation that is working hard every single day and is playing a valuable and a vital part in helping to get this country through. And I think it is wrong for figures to be quoted in a way that unfairly undermines the efforts that Test and Protect staff are making. Secondly, on the NHS, this government is supporting the NHS through the recovery plan, through the resources that have been identified to back the recovery plan, as well, of course, as the overall commitment to increase NHS funding. It's interesting, though, and this will be relevant to the point I'm about to make in relation to COVID certification. It's interesting because the plan that Douglas Ross derides here, which is the Scottish Government plan to increase NHS capacity by 10%, backed by investment, Douglas Ross here says that that is insufficient, and yet yesterday the Conservative government at Westminster announced their own plan, and guess what that plan was? And I don't know whether Douglas Ross is at Westminster right now, but I suspect he'll support it in that context, because that plan was to increase NHS capacity by, guess what, 10%. So again, we have Douglas Ross backing things that are done by the Conservative government in Westminster, but criticising exactly the same things that are done here in Scotland. Which takes me on to vaccine certification. We will set out the work that I've alluded to today in advance of the debate tomorrow. Parliament, rightly and properly, has been asked to endorse the principle, and it is absolutely right and proper. Look, just like the UK Government for England, we continue to work with stakeholders to make sure we take account of their views and concerns as we finalise the detail. In fact, we'd be criticised if we weren't to do that. But of course, vaccine certification is already being used in many countries across Europe and the world, and what we are proposing here is also being proposed, of course, by the UK Government for England. And I suspect what we are hearing from Douglas Ross is a justification for the ridiculous position he is going to end up in, where the scheme he is opposing in Scotland is exactly the same one that he is supporting when a Conservative government introduces it in England. So by all means, scrutinise this government, but for goodness sake, try to have a single ounce of consistency as you do it.
Members, I would ask that we cease commenting to one another across the aisles. Thank you. Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I place on record my condolences to all those that have lost a loved one to the virus. The 17 deaths in the last 24 hours is a reminder that this virus has not gone away. I also want to thank our frontline NHS and care workers. They were amongst the first to get the vaccine. They safely got their second dose after 4 weeks. And if, as some research suggests, the efficacy of the vaccine declines over time, then surely they should also be considered for inclusion in the early booster programme. Is that an issue the First Minister can address? The three issues covered by the First Minister in her statement today were the vaccine passports, the JCV advice on 12 to 15-year-olds and the wider vaccination programme. We will of course have a wider debate on the substance of COVID passports tomorrow, and we shouldn't allow that debate to distract from the big issues and challenges that we currently face. Although I must say that there is still limited engagement with businesses about the details of the programme and how they will actually work in practice. I would also stress that at key moments throughout this pandemic, we have supported the government. So this is not opposition for opposition's sake or an ideological opposition. It's about what works and what will make a meaningful difference. On the JCVI, I recognise what the First Minister says today, but I think we should have the principle for any 12 to 15-year-old who wants the vaccine, they should be entitled to get the vaccine. So let's look at the current tools. Test and Protect is still far from meeting its standard. That is clearly a criticism of those that are in charge of running the system, not those that work in the system. And frankly, it does a disservice to the staff to hide behind them, the very staff that you under-resource and undervalue, and then come to use them as protection. And if you look at the stats for the 0 to 14-year-olds in terms of the spread of the virus, actually it shows you the consequence of not using Test and Protect in our schools and the devastating impact that has had. And on vaccines, data published today shows that there are nearly 200,000 Scots who have had their first vaccine, are now past the 8-week period for eligibility for their second vaccine, but have still not yet had that vaccine. So make no mistake, that is a colossal failure of the government and the one that is putting public health at risk on a daily basis. So rather than creating new systems, what urgent action will the government take to fix the systems that we have, to finally resource and fix Test and Protect, and find the missing 200,000?
First Minister.
Firstly, on issues of vaccination, on those who haven't had vaccine yet, who are eligible either for a first dose or who have passed the 8-week interval for their second dose, they have all been written to. We continue to make efforts to encourage and persuade those who haven't been vaccinated to come forward. But this is not a mandatory vaccination programme. And Anna Sarwar appears to be, again, getting himself into the position where he has, and I'll come back to this point shortly, where he is setting his face against COVID certification without, and as far as I can tell, looking at any of the detail or considering any of the evidence from elsewhere in the world, but seems to be getting himself into a position where he's suggesting we should have mandatory vaccination. It is a voluntary programme and we can continue to encourage people to come forward. The uptake rates of this vaccine programme are incredibly high, but we continue to try to get to anybody who hasn't come forward for vaccination so that they are encouraged to come forward, and we'll continue to do that. On the JCVI and on the issues of who's included in a booster programme and on 12 to 15-year-olds, it is important that we base all of our decisions. I'm a politician. I am not a clinician, I'm not a public health expert, and therefore it's important that all of our policy decisions on vaccination are rooted in evidence, either from the JCVI or, in the case of 12 to 15-year-olds, possibly from our Chief Medical Officer. If I was to second-guess or just ignore any evidential base and say that we were going to vaccinate people without that, Anna Sarwar and others, with much legitimacy, I hasten to add, would be criticising us for doing that. So we stand ready to implement any recommendations, but for the sake of the overall confidence in this programme, it is really important that who we vaccinate is rooted in that clinical and expert evidence. Anna Sarwar previously suggested that the Scottish Government should just act unilaterally to decide to reduce the interval between doses, in spite of the fact that we see evidence from Israel, for example, that that is not and would not have been the right thing to do. It would actually have reduced the effectiveness of the protection from vaccination. Secondly, on Test and Protect, the Test and Protect system is working extremely well under significant pressure. Again, just to repeat the point I made to Douglas Ross, I think it was Anna Sarwar's colleague Jackie Bailey that cited last week 43% of cases, only 43% being completed, knowing that she was citing provisional information. This week, the final figure for that week is 82%. So you can already see that Jackie Bailey last week was talking down the performance and the achievements of Test and Protect. The provisional figures will be for this week will be finalised next week, and we'll see the comparison then. And in terms of that WHO standard, last week 85.5% provisional figure, this week 89%. So again, Test and Protect working exceptionally well. We've got a duty to continue to support it. And for Anna Sarwar to say Test and Protect is not working in our schools, suggests that there is a lack of understanding of what is going on in our schools. Contact tracing is being done appropriately and in a proportionate way in our schools, so that we don't have the situation we had before the summer holidays, where lots of children were being required to self-isolate where there wasn't a need for them to do that. We now have a situation which is helping to protect the population, but in a way that minimises disruption to education. And finally, on vaccine certification, I won't preempt tomorrow's debate, but Anna Sarwar says he's not taking a position of opposition for opposition's sake. I'm sorry, presiding officer, but anybody that at a weekend, 4 or 5 days before a debate in Parliament, can decide, without considering the evidence, without looking at the detail, that they, come what may, are going to vote against it, I'm afraid is indulging in opposition for opposition's sake.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Rising case numbers and the uptick in admissions to ICU are both extremely worrying. Presiding Officer, the contact tracing system is broken, and it is not doing down our contact tracers to point out how overstretched they are. Indeed, Scottish Liberal Democrats have been warning about the system approaching meltdown all summer. Our research found positive cases waiting up to a week to be interviewed. Ministers should be recruiting contact tracers, not reducing the reach of that programme. Alongside vaccines, it is the single most important tool we have to stopping people catching COVID. So will the First Minister commit to an emergency recruitment drive now for new tracers?
First Minister.
I think we've just in the last couple of weeks recruited 100 more. We don't do emergency recruitment drives. We recruit and support Test and Protect as we go along, depending on the need for the system. Alex Cole-Hamilton is right. It's not talking down Test and Protect staff to raise legitimate concerns, certainly not to scrutinise the government. My point is, it is, I think, doing down the efforts of Test and Protect to cite misleading figures. Figures that suggest it is performing at a level that is not reflective of the reality, and the 43% cited last week that is actually in reality 82% is a case in point. You know, today's report, more than 80%, 83.4% of positive cases being interviewed within 48 hours of them being in the case management system. The WHO target in terms of the provisional figures this week being met, although they'll be finalised next week. So yes, it's a system under pressure, but it's a system operating and performing well, and every one of us in this chamber owes every single one of them a deep debt of gratitude.
Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, for island communities, life can still be all too easily disrupted by the pandemic. Last month, 65 ferry sailings to and from Brodick were lost over 11 days at the height of the summer season, causing massive disruption, primarily due to positive COVID-19 tests among CalMac crew members. Can the First Minister advise as to the protocols being put in place to minimise further disruption as we head into autumn and winter, not least because of reports today that that mask wearing among passengers has declined significantly in recent days?
First Minister.
Well, ferry operators continue to reinforce the messages around complying with current legislation regarding face coverings. They also have enhanced cleaning measures in place and are promoting the guidance on travelling safely on public transport. Transport Scotland continues to engage with all of the Lifeline ferry operators around the efforts they're making in this regard, and also on the wider resilience of the network. The recent spate of COVID-related incidents on some ferry routes and vessels is of course concerning, but we need to remember that even though most restrictions have been lifted, the virus is circulating, and we all need to continue to take care, as I've been setting out again today, and think about our own behaviours, whether that's at work, at home or while travelling. And if we all comply with all of these measures, whether on public transport or elsewhere, we will continue to bear down on the number of cases we're seeing.
Miles Briggs to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The tragic death of Sarah Harding has once again highlighted the devastating impact of breast cancer and the results and has resulted in UK cancer charities seeing over 800% increase in contacts. Now, concerns have been expressed regarding breast cancer screening programmes here in Scotland not potentially returning to full service for years to come, with limited options for women under 50 and over 70 to self-refer. Can I ask the First Minister, when will breast cancer services across Scotland be fully restored? And for women under 50 and over 70 with a history of breast cancer in their families, what referral screening pathways will now be urgently developed?
First Minister.
This is obviously an important issue at any time, but obviously, given the tragic death of Sarah Harding earlier in the week, it is uppermost in many people's and particularly many women's minds. I'm going to ask the Health Secretary to write in detail and put the letter in spice about the different referral pathways. One of the things which is relevant to all cancers, of course, that we are in the process of doing is establishing the first 3 already operational early diagnosis cancer centres, which are intended to be an alternative to the existing urgent referral pathway to identify perhaps the less common symptoms of cancer, so that there is another route in. So there's a lot of work being done there. In terms of the breast screening programme, and I know this because I have recently entered the eligible age group, the breast screening programme is up and running and operational. It was paused for a period at the height of the first wave of COVID, but has been up and running again for some time. And of course, work is underway. The urgent care, in particular cancer care, continue to be prioritised during the pandemic, but there are efforts underway in cancer care as across all of the health service to make sure that any backlogs are addressed as quickly as possible. But given the importance of this issue, as I said at the outset, Presiding Officer, I'll make sure further information on various referral pathways are put in spice.
Gillian Martin to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I note that the JCVI made the recommendation on vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds based on being what they've called marginal gain. Many of my constituents have been in touch to ask me to put forward their concerns about their young adult children not being vaccinated and the anxieties they have and them potentially missing more school time and being unprotected by the vaccine in those schools. And I appreciate the First Minister advises that the Chief Medical Officer is reporting back within days with advice, but what criteria on societal impacts will be used in addition to the clinical criteria? First Minister.
Well, I mean, this is an important issue, and Gillian Martin's question gets to the heart of it. To be fair to the JCVI, it is constituted with expertise to allow consideration of health benefits and health risks of vaccination. And that is what it has done in this respect, and that's the basis for the recommendation it made. It's worth reiterating it did conclude that the benefits of vaccinating this age group outweighed the risks, but overall didn't think that was sufficient to recommend vaccination for all. However, crucially, it recognised that there were wider considerations, but not considerations that the JCVI could properly take into account, but that governments could appropriately and properly take into account. So that is why the 4 governments have asked their chief medical officers to do exactly that and to look at the wider benefits of possible vaccination. That will include possible minimisation of disruption to education, but that work is being undertaken by the CMOs, and it's important that they are allowed to do that work independently, taking account of all of the advice they think is relevant and taking account of all of the wider factors that they think is relevant. As I said earlier on, we expect to receive that advice quickly. I'm hoping we will receive that advice in a matter of days, and as soon as we do, Parliament will be informed.
John Mason to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde for correcting my online vaccination record. I just wonder if the First Minister can say anything about how many people we reckon have the record wrongly recorded, and what people can do about it, and when we can catch up on that.
First Minister.
I have a figure for how many people may have their information incorrectly recorded. I wouldn't expect that to be a significant proportion. I will check to see whether that can be made available. But more importantly, if any data on anyone's vaccination status record is incorrect, they can phone the COVID status helpline, and that will be investigated and rectified as quickly as possible. And just to provide the helpline number, it's 0808 196 8565.
Pauline McNeill to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you. Michael Kill, Chief Executive Officer of the Nighttime Industries Association, has warned that nightlife businesses will lose more than 1/3 of their trade overnight if COVID passports are made mandatory. He also said that, contrary to popular belief, much of our core market and workforce will not accept being coerced into taking the vaccine. I wondered if the First Minister could tell Parliament if she considered this viewpoint in coming to her decision, and given what the nighttime industries have said about the impact on their sector, what mitigation will the Scottish Government offer to the nighttime sector, which has been closed for over 18 months during the pandemic?
First Minister.
Look, there is a pretty basic reality here for all countries. We can't wave a magic wand and make COVID go away. It continues to circulate. We're about to enter a winter period where it's going to pose significant challenges for all of us. So the question for all of us is not, can we get away with doing nothing? It's how do we protect the country in a way that is as proportionate and as least restrictive as possible. So in terms of nightclubs and the nighttime industry, I absolutely recognise that nobody wants to have a system of vaccine certification, and nobody wants it to be in place for any longer than is necessary. But the alternative to that, particularly in higher risk settings, is not doing nothing. The alternative to that may well be facing the situation of having to have further periods of closure of some of these higher risk settings. So that is, I'm afraid, the hard reality that governments simply can't escape. This is about what is the most proportionate thing to do to keep people as safe as possible and to keep these venues open even during what is likely to be a very challenging winter period. And we can't escape that reality, and we can't escape these choices. So people who argue against vaccine certification, as I say, it's working in many countries across Europe, people who argue against it have to then say, well, how do you think we should keep these higher risk settings open as cases might increase during the winter without facing further periods of closure? I'm afraid governments have to face these hard realities. We can't simply put our head in the sand and ignore them.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister has rightly, and on the basis of clinical and medical advice, decided to continue the requirement of face coverings when in indoor public spaces. Could the First Minister reiterate the importance of the continued need for face coverings and their benefit in helping to stop the spread of COVID-19? And could she comment on whether there is any clinical advice which suggests that the use of FFP2 face masks and appropriately fitted face coverings, particularly as we approach winter, where people will be indoors more often, whether that's the best way for people to protect themselves and others?
First Minister.
Well, face coverings play an important part in stopping the spread, even as vaccine is rolled out. Scientific evidence shows that fabric face coverings of 2 or preferably 3 layers do help to reduce transmission. Face coverings, of course, are most effective when they are fit correctly over somebody's mouth, nose and chin. The mandatory requirement to continue face coverings is subject to regular review and will continue to take account of scientific, social and economic factors as well as latest clinical evidence. And we consider in clinical settings as well, Emma Harper related to FFP2 masks. In clinical settings, we also continue to consider the most appropriate PPE to be used, but we'll continue to keep all of these requirements under review. We are legally required to make sure that any requirement is necessary and proportionate, and of course any changes to legal restrictions will always be scrutinised by Parliament.
Sharon Dowie, to be followed by Audrey Nicholl. Come on. Miss Dowie, can I just, perhaps your microphone is down, no, or your card's, is your card in? Okay. Is it on now, Miss Dowie? Thank you.
I raised the subject of podiatry appointments with the First Minister previously in June, with the Health Secretary writing to me as well. But my constituents are still unable to access paused NHS services, not just in relation to podiatry but also dentistry. While I understand the principles of remobilise, recover, redesign may take time to implement, for many this means potentially another 6 months of pain, isolation and the inability to stay active. So will the First Minister provide an update on when paused NHS services will fully resume, and can she also guarantee that sufficient staff and resources will be in place to ensure that there will be no shortfall in the services provided, so all patients get the treatment they require within 12 weeks of services resuming?
First Minister.
I will certainly undertake to provide an update. The member referred to dentist services. Dental services, of course, continue to struggle, as many sectors do, with increased transmission, but operating much more normally. Podiatry services, and this will apply to a lot of other NHS services, the continued constraint on moving back to face-to-face appointments is the continued requirement around distancing to try to reduce the risk of transmission. But the health service is progressively getting more of these services back to normal, and that includes more face-to-face consultations. But on podiatry in particular, I will of course ask the Health Secretary to give an update to his last correspondence in, I think the member said, June. More generally on resourcing, we've set out our commitment to NHS resourcing, and we'll continue to keep that under review. On staffing, we have record numbers of staff in the National Health Service. We have a commitment to increase the staffing complement in the National Health Service. I have to be frank, like many sectors of our economy right now, the health service and other public services are struggling with shortages of staff, which are largely to do with the Brexit impact and the reduction in the labour supplies that we have. So these are issues, again, that we need to grapple with, and they affect our health service just as they are affecting food supply and other parts of our economy.
Audrey Nicholl, to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In recent weeks, a number of my constituents have inquired about the option to double up their winter flu vaccine with a COVID booster. While JCVI advice is awaited on any requirement for a COVID booster, can the First Minister confirm if consideration is being given to administering both the winter flu vaccine and, if applicable, the COVID booster at the same time?
First Minister.
In short, yes, we are considering all possible delivery options to make it as easy as possible for people being vaccinated, but also as easy as possible for the NHS administering vaccination programmes. As I've indicated already, the JCVI is still considering evidence on benefits of booster vaccines for the wider population, so we're awaiting their final advice. The interim advice has allowed us to do some initial planning, and we're trying to make sure that that operates in as much synergy with the flu vaccination programme as possible. We're also currently working with health boards to plan the seasonal flu vaccine programme and making sure that we align these two programmes as much as possible, but that will partly be dependent on the timing of the JCVI advice on booster COVID vaccinations and the detail of that advice, but we will continue to update Parliament as regularly as possible.
Ross Greer, to be followed by Colette Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been contacted by a constituent whose child's school is currently dealing with hundreds of pupil absences and a number of staff absences due to COVID. His daughter's close friends both tested positive, but despite identifying herself as a close contact, she's heard nothing from Test and Protect. This is a separate school from the one whose similar absence rate I raised with the First Minister last week. We know this is happening across the country. So can I ask if the First Minister believes that current guidance for schools is sufficiently reducing both disruption and infections, and how the Scottish Government are ensuring that funding allocated for ventilation improvements is being used in a timely manner?
First Minister.
On the first point about contact tracing in schools, obviously I'm not able to comment on the particular case, but there is a much more proportionate approach being taken by Test and Protect to identify the circumstances in which a young person is considered to be a close contact or not, because we know that prior to the summer holidays, many young people had quite lengthy periods of isolation and therefore disruption to their education when, on reflection, that possibly wasn't necessary in terms of reducing the risk. But it is important that we keep this under review. In the last couple of weeks, I've asked for this to be reviewed and looked at and for advice to be updated, and the advice I have is that it continues to be appropriate to have the guidance that is currently in place, but as the situation changes, we will make sure that we keep all of the guidance that is in place under review. On the issue of ventilation and CO2 monitors, again, there is work ongoing with local authorities to make sure that the funding that has been provided for CO2 monitors are being used, that CO2 monitors are being used in all school and education settings, but crucially that is supporting what we've set out before, the process of assessment that we've asked to be completed before the October break to decide whether there are any longer-term changes to the ventilation systems required in schools. And again, we'll report on that as regularly as possible, but the work is underway with local authorities to ensure that that is being done.
Colette Stevenson, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Constituents have told me that online vaccine status doesn't record doses received elsewhere in the common travel area. Could the First Minister outline the steps being taken to resolve this?
First Minister.
Well, if you are a Scottish citizen and you've received one or more of your vaccinations outside of Scotland but within the common travel area, you can phone the status helpline that I mentioned a moment ago, 0808 196 8565. Ongoing collaboration is taking place between Scottish Government and NHS Digital to establish appropriate data sharing agreements within the common travel area. We're working to make sure we rectify that situation as soon as possible. Those who live in Scotland but have been vaccinated outside of Scotland or England should obtain proof of their vaccination from the country they are vaccinated in.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Stephanie Callaghan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, earlier today I was able to download my record of vaccination certificate. Within a minute, I managed to create a copy where I was able to change every single detail on that certificate. That's not a particularly robust system, is it?
First Minister.
It actually is, because the one thing you couldn't change and the thing that matters is the QR code. You can't change the QR code. So I don't pretend to be a technical expert on all of this, but we set that out quite clearly last week. So I wouldn't advise the member to seek to travel on the forged document that he has just admitted to having, because the QR code and his ID documents will probably find him out.
Stephanie Callaghan, to be followed by Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With new COVID cases in Lanarkshire still
Colleagues,
the highest in Europe.
Can we please hear the member? Thank you.
With new COVID cases in Lanarkshire still the highest in Europe, and with proportionately higher levels of A&E attendance and hospital admissions in Lanarkshire than other Scottish NHS areas, can I ask the First Minister what additional support the Scottish Government can provide NHS Lanarkshire to respond to the immediate and worrying situation locally?
First Minister.
Well, obviously, we continue to work with local partners. The area that Evelyn Tweed represents is hard hit, and we continue to work with the Health Board there, with the local authority, and more broadly to make sure that the situation with COVID cases is being addressed appropriately, but broader recovery is also being taken account of. The Stirling and Kilmanshire deal has been impacted by COVID, but there is work ongoing with regional partners to ensure that the deal is delivered, and that work will continue. And I'm happy to ask the relevant Minister to write to Evelyn Tweed with a full update.
Evelyn Tweed, to be followed by Paul O'Kane.
I think there was a slight mistake there, because I don't think the First Minister heard the appropriate question because of all the noise.
Can I call Evelyn Tweed for your question, Ms Tweed?
Okay. Thanks, Presiding Officer. As our minds turn to economic recovery, it's important that we act ambitiously to unlock Scotland's potential. Can the First Minister advise what steps the Scottish Government is undertaking to ensure the delivery of the Stirling and Kilmanshire City region deal is accelerated as a result of the pandemic? Thank you.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, can I firstly apologise to Stephanie Callaghan and take full responsibility for getting her mixed up with Evelyn Tweed and the questions mixed up. It is my responsibility. I am not making excuses, but there is constant noise that is making it sometimes difficult for me to hear. But it is my responsibility, and I apologise to Stephanie Callaghan. And on Evelyn Tweed, the answer I gave a moment ago in terms of the work that is ongoing around the deal in particular, I will make sure that update gets to her. But my apologies again to both members for that confusion, which was confusion on my part.
Paul O'Kane, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister says that the work of Test and Protect is vital and hugely appreciated. Yet 2 months since I first raised with her concerns of Test and Protect staff feeling stressed and overwhelmed, whistleblowers now describe the situation as staff being burnt out. Test and Protect is stretched to breaking point, with reports of contact tracers being told only to make 2 calls before closing a case in order to get through the volume of calls, and staff have also reported not feeling listened to when scripts change. The First Minister also referred in previous answers to the overall number of cases being closed. However, the figures for the week ending the 29th of August show that only 60.5% of completed contact tracing was completed within 72 hours. That's 13,330, taking over the 72 hours from the time cases were recorded on the system, not tested. So I would ask her to just clarify the position on that point and indeed answer what is she doing to fix, test and protect and support our hard-working staff.
First Minister.
We continue to take steps to support staff and we will continue to do so. The staff in Test and Protect are working under extreme pressure. They have my gratitude, but it's more important that they have our ongoing support through recruiting more staff and making sure that they have the resources they need. The point about provisional versus finalised figures is an important one, and I think it is really important that we all understand that. And I've been making the point today that it is important to wait for the finalised figures. Now, in the ones that the member has quoted, which are the ones assessing the performance within the WHO target, what usually happens there is the provisional figure is higher than the finalised figure. So last week's provisional figure, which was over 80%, has now, in the finalised figure, come to the level that the member has cited today. However, the provisional figure today... No, it's not. I'll come back to the second point in a minute. The provisional figure today is higher than the provisional figure last week. So we'll see the finalised figure next week, but it suggests an improvement in performance. The other figure, the one that Jackie Bailey cited last week and Douglas Ross cited today, is the figure for the overall number of cases being closed. Now, what we find in that figure is that the provisional data is much lower than the finalised data. So the 43% last week became 82% today. I know that is complex, but it is reflective of a system that when you report at a snapshot date, there are many cases that are still in process. So it takes a few days after that for the figure to be finalised. I really would encourage all members to look in detail, those who haven't done so already, at these figures to understand that difference between provisional and final. And it would then perhaps stop any of us using provisional figures in a way that is misleading and in a way that I'm sure inadvertently does underplay and understate the performance of those working so hard in Test and Protect.
And Rona Mackay.
Confirm that COVID vaccine certificates will be available for people who've had their first or both vaccines from those outside the common travel areas such as Canada or Australia.
First Minister.
Well, as I said a moment ago, if you're a Scottish citizen and you've received one or more of your vaccinations outside Scotland but within the common travel area, you should contact the helpline and that is taken account of. We're continuing to work with NHS Digital to establish data sharing arrangements within the common travel area and broader than that internationally, and those arrangements will be in place as soon as possible. But if you live in Scotland but you've been vaccinated outside of Scotland or outside of England, where there is already that data sharing agreement, you should obtain proof of your vaccination from the country you were vaccinated in.
That concludes the First Minister's statement. COVID-19 updates. There will be a short suspension before we move on to the next. Point of order, Gillian Mackay.
Presiding Officer, there's a strong point to be made from that last session of noise within the chamber. Over the last couple of weeks in particular, the noise level has prohibited me from participating fully as a member with a disability. I'd be really appreciative if you could write to business managers in particular to set out how we can continue to make the chamber a place where everybody can participate despite their disabilities.
Thank you. I thank Ms Mackay for that point of order. I have several times asked members for quiet since taking up this role when others are speaking. While we don't want a sterile, wholly silent chamber, nor do we want it to become the norm that when members are making a contribution, others cannot hear the member properly, they can't hear interventions, and generally it makes their full participation in business very challenging indeed. I would just refer members once again to the Code of Conduct, which urges that members treat one another at all times with courtesy and respect. It is indeed a debating chamber, but it need not be a chamber where others are constantly speaking when members are doing their best to represent their constituents. Thank you.
Colleagues, can I ask that we get ready to move on to the next item of business, please? This will be, before I do so, I remind members that social distancing measures are in place in the Chamber and across the Holyrood campus. I ask that members take care to observe these measures, including when entering and exiting the Chamber. Please only use the aisles and walkways to access your seat and when moving around the Chamber. The next item of business is a Scottish Government debate on Programme for Government 2021 to 22 on the economy. I would invite all members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I would call on the Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes to open the debate for the Scottish Government. The Cabinet Secretary is joining us remotely in terms of the rules on self-isolation. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, the First Minister announced our programme for government, setting out our ambitions for the next 12 months and the duration of this Parliament. And I think we would all agree that this publication comes at a hugely important time in the pandemic. We remain focused on keeping the country safe with the recent surge in cases as we tentatively move towards recovery. Despite the challenges, this year's programme for government marks a moment of renewed hope and opportunity. It sets out the actions we will take to nurture economic prosperity for all of Scotland's people and places, whether they be urban or rural. It reinforces our commitment and our support to the entrepreneurs, the business leaders and the workers that day in, day out produce, create, provide services which our economy and communities depend on. And in so doing, they provide employment opportunities and they drive investment and innovation in the economy. And our role is simple. It's to enable and to support that entrepreneurial drive and ensure that Scotland remains a great place to start, to develop, to locate and to grow a business. We want to create a pro-prosperity, pro-business and pro-jobs environment, which fosters entrepreneurship and makes Scotland an even more attractive place for investors. We can stimulate business growth by investing in our people and expanding opportunities. And we can also do it with well-paid and fair jobs whilst securing a just transition to net zero. Presiding Officer, our new 10-year national strategy for economic transformation will be key to delivering that vision. It's due to be published in late autumn, alongside a new national challenge competition, which will provide up to £50 million for projects with the greatest potential to transform Scotland's economy. And that will be a crucial part of building that successful, thriving, prosperous Scotland that hopefully all of us in the Chamber want to see. It will deliver the long-term transformational change that we need to build a sustainable, fairer, more inclusive economy where everybody can flourish. Presiding Officer, it's clear that the pandemic has taken its toll on Scottish businesses, putting livelihoods at risk, and all of this has been exacerbated by the impact of the recent EU exit. Since the start of the pandemic, all of us, including our businesses, have made sacrifices to protect public health. And helping those hard-hit businesses get back on their feet and our economy back to growth is crucial. Over the past 18 months, we've invested strongly to support Scottish businesses, providing more than £3.7 billion in direct business support since March 2020. We extended 100% of non-domestic rates relief for all retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation premises for all of this financial year, which, alongside other measures such as a reduction to the poundage, ensures that Scotland offers the most generous non-domestic rates regime anywhere in the UK. And in addition to these policies, we have committed over £1.7 billion to build a stronger and more sustainable economy. Our support has gone further than that provided in the rest of the UK. In January, we provided more than £230 million through retail, hospitality and leisure top-up grants. And as a result, those businesses in Scotland received significantly more than their counterparts south of the border. Our culture, heritage and events sector received £175 million, far more than we received in consequentials from the UK government. And of course, our work does not stop now. We will continue to work with those that have seen the hardest impact as we move forward. That will include extending and refreshing the way that we work in partnership with businesses, large and small, in every part of Scotland. The Small Business Bonus Scheme, Fresh Start Relief and the Business Growth Accelerator will continue for the lifetime of this Parliament, and we're supporting the recommendations of the Tourism Recovery Task Force, considering the best approach to future years, as well as promoting a thriving rural economy through the new £20 million Rural Entrepreneur Fund. I'm in no doubt that an innovative and entrepreneurial private sector is essential to support a well-being economy and is essential to delivering this programme for government. The programme for government clearly sets out our intentions to help create and support that entrepreneurial private sector. Alongside our enterprise agencies and the Scottish National Investment Bank, we will support businesses at the forefront of developing the technologies of tomorrow by increasing funding for research and development to £100 million over this Parliament, which was a specific ask by some of the business organisations. We recognise the vital role that international trade and investment plays in enhancing the productivity, and we will work to deliver our international economy plans underpinned by our values-led vision for trade. We're continuing our work to develop a digital economy, something that's particularly close to my heart. We are implementing the recommendations of the Logan Review, and we're providing £100 million to improve digital capabilities across businesses. In addition, CivTech will receive £46 million to create more opportunities for innovative businesses and up to 700 new high-value jobs. We'll also deliver future-proofed mobile and broadband connectivity the length and breadth of Scotland through Scottish 4G infill and Reaching 100% programmes, and we'll begin delivering our 5-year £35 million programme to digitally transform planning services. Presiding Officer, over the next 5 years, we want to invest to help businesses in promoting the good, green jobs that will help secure the just transition to net zero. Whilst we have a moral obligation and a legal obligation to meet our ambitious targets to end Scotland's contribution to climate change, I firmly believe that there is also an enormous economic opportunity to be grasped here. So we want to do this whilst ensuring we deliver the just transition that will have a positive impact on every aspect of our lives, including delivering more job security and fairer work. And our cooperation agreement with the Greens will only push us forward in our plans to do that. This Green Jobs Fund will provide £100 million over the next 5 years to help businesses create employment through investment. And our commitment to infrastructure is steadfast. We will invest in the infrastructure that we know we need to boost our recovery, with £33 billion over the course of this Parliament in the National Infrastructure Mission to create new jobs and markets and deliver benefits across Scottish supply chains. In the coming year, we'll start work to develop options for the creation of a new national infrastructure company, and we'll announce the first Pathfinder projects for the Green Growth Accelerator ahead of COP26. That will mark an important first step in unlocking up to £200 million of public sector investment and incentivising local authorities to deliver low-carbon infrastructure. The Scottish National Investment Bank will also continue to build its portfolio with £1 billion of capital funding across the Parliament. Presiding Officer, whilst good green jobs represent enormous economic and environmental opportunities for Scotland's recovery, we need to make sure that those opportunities are distributed fairly and that they meet the needs of our businesses. We are all acutely conscious of the current chronic labour shortages in sectors which are central to our recovery, including tourism and hospitality and logistics. And that is clearly connected to the UK Government's damaging migration rules. We have written to the UK Government asking for an urgent meeting and to push for changes that would increase Scotland's ability to import and distribute essential goods. This Government, together with a number of business organisations, have and will continue to press the UK Government to urgently revise its immigration policy before further damage is done. And going forward, we will continue to work with business, understand their skills needs, to address long-standing recruitment and retention challenges, and to equip people with the skills that employers need now and in the future. We want to promote and maximise employability and skills interventions that will help workers enter into or progress in sectors where there is key demand, and will support those most impacted by the pandemic in that process. We will support them into fair work, young people, women and lone parents, disabled people, those from minority ethnic communities and lower income households. In order to do that, over the lifetime of the Parliament, we will invest an additional £500 million to support those jobs of the future, including upskilling and reskilling people to access those jobs and to address skills gaps and shortages. Presiding Officer, young people will also be supported into employment with up to £70 million for the Young Persons Guarantee this year, and we'll also invest up to £20 million through our No One Left Behind partnership. Presiding Officer, as I draw to a close, there is no doubt, and I think we're all agreed on this in the Chamber, there is no doubt that when we look back, the pandemic clearly has brought with it suffering and sacrifice amongst our business community and beyond. But as we look forward, recovery means we can do things differently to deliver a just transition and to push our economy forward, creating prosperity, business opportunities and jobs. And the programme for government announced yesterday gives us the basis to start that journey towards that economic transformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Liz Smith to open for the Conservatives.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think as we continue the debate about this programme for government, I think it behoves all of us once again to both recognise and to understand that the expectation from the public, as was pretty clearly shown yesterday, is for the Parliament's primary focus to be on economic recovery from the pandemic. And in the same context, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that business and industry are wanting both certainty and stability and a long-term strategy from government which will protect jobs, people's real disposable income and the incentives for investment and economic growth. And on this question of growth, given that there was much debate last week about the Green Party's approach, let me say this. Yes, it is true that there are several measures important when it comes to assessing the progress of any economy. And yes, it's true that GDP and GNP are incomplete measures because they notably admit some variables such as externalities. But that does not take away from the fact that they remain the most important internationally recognised measures precisely because they measure the net output of value added in an economy in terms of the goods and services purchased with money. And so, there will always be an extremely good guide to which areas of the economy are working well in terms of securing employment, improving productivity and creating new investment, all of which, of course, help to determine real disposable income. And if we don't have that strong economic growth, then we all suffer. Common sense surely tells us that. Of course.
John Mason.
Would the member accept that we can have growth, but sometimes not everyone benefits?
Liz Smith.
Yes, I said earlier in my speech that there are other measures that can determine economic growth, but the primary concern about growth in any economy is because it provides the facility to do other things that are so important and to allow for measures that will reduce some of the inequalities that we have in our society. Because it doesn't matter which business you talk to, whether it's small, medium or large, which economic forecasters or public policy units you listen to, or which financial services you're speaking to, they are all telling us unanimously that economic growth is the most important thing post-pandemic. And so I'm afraid when it comes to the Greens, it really is the Greens against the business world. And I wonder where the SNP really is coming from on this. Because it's not that long ago when the SNP was agreeing with the business world. Nicola Sturgeon at the SNP conference, and I quote, "Our government's priority is economic growth and will do everything we can to get the economy growing again." John Swinney, when as Finance Secretary and Deputy First Minister he was giving evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee, he explained why the priority of the Scottish Government was to maximise investment and support economic growth. Kate Forbes, earlier this year, when she was reacting to concerns raised by Sir Tom Hunter about the SNP's approach to business, she said, "That is why this government is absolutely committed to being pro-prosperity, pro-growth and pro-business." And I don't disagree with any of these three senior SNP ministers when they make these comments, because they are right about the importance of growth. But why on earth do you go into a coalition with a party that is fundamentally opposed to this as a priority? That will be a tension that will continue to dominate the coalition for however long that lasts. Now, Kate Forbes said at committee on the 31st of August that she would like to build a 10-year economic strategy, and she repeated that today. But she also said that she thinks that that can't happen in full because she doesn't have the necessary funds from the UK government to address the exogenous shocks to the economy or sufficient information about the timescales which will underpin how Scotland will benefit from various UK projects such as the Shared Prosperity Fund, Levelling Up and the Community Renewal Funds. And on this latter point, I think there will be welcome news in the Chancellor's next budget that details of these funds will emerge. But when she complains about the UK Government not providing the necessary funds to assist the critical economic challenges ahead, I really do wonder how she thinks the Scottish Government would have been in a position to fund the COVID recovery without the massive injection of UK cash, most especially in terms of furlough and especially in terms of the huge assistance that's now to be provided via the Health and Social Care Plan.
Ivan Mackay.
Bizarre comment for Liz Smith to ask because she knows the answer to it. The question back to her is, how has every other country in the world managed to do it? Do you think Scotland would be unique amongst almost 200 countries in the world in being unable to support our economy through the COVID pandemic?
Liz Smith.
Is Mr Mackay really saying that we would have had the same benefit without the UK of ensuring that they... Really? You are actually claiming, Mr Mackay, that our COVID recovery...
Ms Smith, sorry, just if let's chat across the room. If you wish to, the member wishes to ask Mr Mackay to confirm or clarify or whatever, perhaps Mr Mackay could stand up and it not be done sort of sotto voce if that's possible. It's up to the member, though, if she takes the intervention or not.
No, I'm not going to take the intervention, Deputy Presiding Officer, because I really can't believe that he actually asked that question, because it's abundantly clear. Let's go to the... Let's go... No, I won't, Mr Mackay. Let's go to Professor Mark Blythe, who I believe is one of your top advisers and an independent supporter, I think. He's warning that independence upheaval will be Brexit times 10. And I think that view is shared by a lot in the Scottish business community and indeed amongst the public. Now, on this side of the chamber, we are very clear in our minds that the economy brief must have as its primary focus policies which will support enterprise, especially assisting small-scale business and new start-ups, and policies which will drive innovation and sustainable infrastructures. That is particularly true for the small business sector, and we should remember that many of our small businesses are those which help our local communities most of all, and which employ 43% of private sector jobs. These firms are the ones which have had a disproportionate Brexit burden and a disproportionate debt, a point that was made very strongly to myself and Murdo Fraser when we met the FSP just a few days ago. We support the Small Business Recovery Plan, including the business rates relief aspects, because it's very clear that the current system of taxing non-domestic property does not work for too many businesses. Physical retailers... I won't if you don't mind. Physical retailers find themselves paying higher taxes than their competitors, despite the fact that they're obviously addressing more local jobs. And I think a very interesting comment was made at the Finance Committee yesterday by Kevin Robertson of the Scottish Property Federation, who is arguing that actually we perhaps need some legislative change to make tax more modern and more efficient. And then, of course, there are all the issues about skills. And I think Sandy Begbie and the SFE have made it very clear about the need for better pathways for apprenticeships, taking advantage of the huge global fintech market, technology hubs and also net zero objectives. And they're very clear about the connectivity and the collaboration that is required between firms in Scotland, much better links between governments and the private sector, and the development of far more digital skills. But may I finish on a point which I think is very important, and that is about the huge demand amongst businesses, as well as amongst the public, for better value for money within public services. The Scottish Government has presided over disasters when it comes to things like ferries and BIFAB, to name just two projects which have brought into serious question a lack of transparency and accountability of public money. And it is interesting too that the Auditor General is making some very strong criticisms about the gap between the Scottish Government's commitment and its delivery. And of course, committees in this Parliament have in some cases concluded that there has been a catastrophic failure in the management of the procurement of public money. Members have heard me speak several times in this chamber about transparency, and I hope this parliamentary session will do a lot to improve transparency, accountability and the scrutiny of financial decision-making. But I am absolutely clear, Deputy Presiding Officer, that there should be one focus and one focus alone, and that is on economic recovery.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I now call on Daniel Johnson to open for Labour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The pandemic is not over, it is peaking. Recovery is not underway, it has barely begun. The project of recovery will demand our full attention for the duration of this Parliament and beyond. The success or failure of that project will shape a generation. That is the challenge that the programme for government needed to rise to. But my fear is that it barely engages with the requirements of that recovery, let alone the challenges or how to address them. The word recovery does appear, but the announcements are either retreads or so inconsequential they barely scratch the surface. A word that is mentioned is independence. But independence wouldn't be quick. There would be 20 years of economic uncertainty and cost, capital flight, Brexit times 10. Not my analysis, but those of Professor Mark Blythe, one of the First Minister's leading economic advisers. Recovery demands urgency and prolonged action. It will not be done by 2023. But it's clear from the First Minister's statement yesterday that she is more comfortable with a constitutional circus than the seriousness demanded by economic recovery. Ministers should actually talk to businesses. They don't think recovery is done, and they are worried. They have debts, even those that have never traded with debt. Small business owners have cashed in their pensions and remortgaged their houses to keep going. Customer volumes are down on where they should be. They have no clarity on what measures may be coming next, and they know that some habits have been changed forever by lockdown. It's not just small retailers or small shops. Online has risen by 50%, with the majority of that going to large online retailers. Footfall is 30% down. Chains are shutting 30 stores a week. Retail is 10% of private sector employment. And we have to ask the question, will it continue to be? But it's not just retail. Right across consumer-facing sectors, the patterns and stories are the same. So these are the things that a recovery plan needs to deal with. Debt, changed behaviours, resilience, but most importantly, jobs. Debt, we need practical and financial help for businesses whose balance sheets are now loaded with debt. Figures from the FSB have outlined that small firms have taken out £4.1 billion worth of debt over the last 18 months. Changed behaviours, help for businesses to transition because their customers are not coming back, working from home, shopping online. Resilience, we need clarity and advice so that businesses have systems in place to continue to trade as and when new measures are imposed to control the virus. And on jobs, the most important point, the jobs we did before the pandemic may not be the ones we do post-recovery. We must help people to reskill and retrain and businesses adapt. If we don't, the consequences will be counted in those jobs being lost. But that analysis, or something similar to it, is completely absent from the programme for government. More importantly, what is absent is a sense of urgency. Of course, we've got the promise of an ill-defined 10-year economic transformation plan to be delivered some months in the future. But economic recovery cannot wait 10 years. We need a 10-month plan to help reskill people and businesses to transition. We need a 10-week plan to ensure businesses survive and people keep their jobs when furlough ends. We don't need more expert groups taking months to produce another report to be ignored by government. We need ministers to get a grip, take responsibility and take action now. And on that note, if Mr Mackay would like to enlighten me, I'd be grateful.
Ivan Mackay.
Take action now. £500 million in upskilling and work learning, £20 million in the National Transition Training Fund, £20 million in No One Left Behind Partnership, £70 million for the Young Persons Guarantee, £20 million for the Rural Entrepreneur Fund. I can go on and on and on. We're doing a lot.
Daniel Johnson.
Every one of those numbers needs to be divided by 5. If you look at the coming year, only £150 million will be spent on reskilling or transition and training, compared to the 150,000 people that were still on furlough through the summer. That is a drop in the ocean, Mr Mackay, and I think you should recognise that. Because without bold action, Scotland faces an unemployment crisis that will become a national emergency. So to talk in more numbers, between April and June this year, there were 119,000 people unemployed in Scotland. But the National Training Fund, just referenced by Mr Mackay, was only targeting 17% of that population. That is shamefully inadequate. We have to ensure that small businesses can access specialist digital support, but the funds offered are not nearly enough. There's a re-announcement of a scheme that is already oversubscribed. Further to that, there are only 2 COVID-related business support schemes. Both are re-announcements, and both will come to an end through this current financial year. Then we come to green jobs. And the Scottish Government has been very keen to lace green words and green credentials through the programme for government. But most, if not all, the green measures are simply recycled. And so what impact have the Greens actually had on programme for government? And I think we got our answer today, because it was confirmed in the press that the Scottish Government has scrapped its plans for a publicly owned energy company. So it's clear that any influence the Greens may have had have been sold out for ministerial job titles without any ministerial influence. Not only has the... I'd be delighted to.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to Mr Johnson for giving way. Does he not think it's also ironic that just a week after the Greens have joined the government, we learned today that the wind farm turbine factory in Mackay in Argyll is now closing permanently? That doesn't demonstrate much of a commitment from this government to supporting green jobs.
Daniel Johnson.
It does strike me that this government is more interested in green posture than green delivery, and I think that that announcement of the wind turbines simply underlines that fact. But not only has the government brought little forward to address the economic recovery, there is no detail or explanation about how existing policies and government machinery will be used to sustain recovery. There is no mention for a role for Scottish Enterprise, South of Scotland Enterprise or Highlands Downs Enterprise. The announcement for the Scottish National Investment Bank isn't new, it's a cut. No plan for how these agencies should work or coordinate to enable or deliver recovery. And the stark fact is this. Despite enterprise support being now needed more than ever before, this SNP government is spending 40% less in real terms than the last year of the last Labour administration. 500 million compared to 800 million in real terms in 2007. Despite one additional agency, a new investment bank and a new apparently integrated board, 40% less at a time of economic growth, despite this being a time of global pandemic. The lack of vision, strategy or clear plan from this government should come as no surprise. This is a government whose economic record is marked by failure and calamity, from dodgy ferries to empty airports to empty and unused turbine yards. When it comes to the economy, this government position seems to be pandemic. What pandemic? The effects of the coronavirus will be with us long after the disease and illness subsides. This is a serious time for serious politics and serious politicians. I'm afraid that the PFG demonstrates that on these measures, this government and these ministers are seriously deficient.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. And I call on Willie Rennie to open for the Lib Dems.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Liz Smith, who I think is just leaving the chamber, unfortunately, made an interesting slip. She said that independence would be Brexit times 10. This is from the Conservative Party that claimed that Brexit was going to be a good thing for our country. But I think what she admitted was a deep uncertainty within the Conservative Party about the reality of it. Not just now, I'm just about finishing the point. That the point is that both are as bad as each other. They should not be repeated. The mistakes of Brexit should be remembered and recalled when we enter this next phase as the SNP try to move forward on independence. Of course, independence would be Brexit times 10, and that is why we should not repeat that mistake. I'll take Murdo Fraser.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to Mr Rennie for giving way. I'm simply rising to defend my colleague Elizabeth Smith, who disappeared to the back of the chamber momentarily, simply to clarify that in saying that, all she was doing was quoting Professor Mark Blyth. Not saying that was her view, but quoting the view of the Scottish Government's new starry-eyed economic advisor.
Willie Rennie.
That's a wonderful contortion. I congratulate Murdo Fraser on that complicated explanation. But I think that extreme position of both the Conservatives and the SNP being as bad as each other with their propositions on Brexit and independence is repeated in terms of the Greens and the Conservatives on economic growth. And I thought it was an interesting contribution from Liz Smith to explore, I think, this very important area. And I think, I rarely say this, but John Mason, I think, was right. We should not have absolutist positions on this. This is not about GDP or nothing. This is about the balance. This is about making sure we take into account the social impact, the economic impact, as well as the environmental impact. And I think governments in the past, particularly Conservatives, have had almost an absolute commitment to the economic growth to the exclusion of all else. So I think the absolutist positions of the Conservatives and the Greens are on the extremes once again that don't actually help us move forward in this debate. So Liz Smith is free to leave the chamber if she wishes now. I'm not going to refer to her anymore. But the coming out of this pandemic was always going to be much more difficult than going into the pandemic. And we've seen this with many business failures as a result, but also the incredibly turbulent position that we've got now. I actually happen to think is a good thing that workers are getting paid an awful lot more, especially those who were on low wages. Of course, it's challenging for businesses who are finding it difficult to get good workers to open their businesses. We've seen many operating restricted hours as a result, and they're not able to meet the pent-up customer demand that we've seen in recent weeks. Of course, it's a good thing they're paid more, but the challenge for business is considerable. We've also seen a shortage of materials, partly as a result of the manufacturing disruption. Also, again, the pent-up demand that has come through. And of course, Brexit as well. But we haven't seen the worst of Brexit yet, because actually the pandemic has partly held the world in suspension. So we may see the full consequences of Brexit yet to hit when the full release of the pandemic comes. And of course, businesses are also facing pressure, good pressure, on climate change, with increasing demands from government and society to reform their operations. All of those things are incredible pressures. Now, for me, adding on top of that, the challenge of independence, I think, would be reckless. And I agreed with the First Minister through the election campaign when she said that the recovery would come first. I think this recovery is going to take a very long time to secure. We've seen the turbulence now. It's going to even take longer to get on top. And even when you take into account the massive challenges that we face in our social care sector, but also in terms of recruiting workers, the economic pressures, but also the NHS, it's going to take a long time to recover from this pandemic. I think it would be reckless to pursue independence in the process. Now, the government is good at promises. I give them credit for that. They've got endless promises, lists of commitments they have made. But their delivery is very poor. Just look at their industrial strategy. Lochaber smelter. I reluctantly come back to that once again. There's no sign of the 2,000 promised jobs for the Fort William area. No sign at all. We're barely keeping the company alive. No sign of the 2,000 jobs. And in terms of Ferguson's, no sign of those ferries for the desperate islanders who want reliable ferry services. And Bifab, there's just no sign of the company at all. It collapsed despite significant government investment. So when it comes to delivery on their promises, they're not particularly good. I'll take an intervention very quickly.
I'm very grateful to Mr Rennie for giving way and entirely agree with the points he's just raised. Does he also agree, and I think he probably does given what he said in the last Parliament, that there is a lot to be said for improving the scrutiny process in this Parliament about public procurement and how the money is spent, because there's far too little we know about who owes what and who owns what?
Willie Rennie?
I'll agree with Liz Smith on that. I think that's a very sensible proposition. I'll just quickly go through some of the key priorities for the next period. We need to reform the skills and training agenda. We need to make sure the apprenticeship levy works more effectively. It's a disincentive for training. We need to have a 12-month COVID recovery visa. That's a UK government responsibility that they need to deliver. We need to sort out the driver training programme. That's going to be a real priority. And of course, universities. Some of our most international institutions are under incredible pressure just now. They are major economic drivers. We need to make sure we support them so they can do more of what they do well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. And we will now move to the open debate. And I call Fiona Hislop to be followed by Donald Cameron. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, we are still living in and with a pandemic and the impacts of that. We should, though, reflect that the Scottish Fiscal Commission has amended its predictions upwards in terms of economic growth for Scotland and downwards for unemployment, and that is positive. I want to focus my remarks on the economic transformation and just transition to the net zero future members across this chamber want to see. This programme for government is ambitious and it is bold and it is based on a very full manifesto which was emphatically endorsed by a victory in the election in May. Do not underestimate the expectations of the people of Scotland for us to work together to tackle these most serious of challenges facing our economy, our society and our environment. Oppositions oppose, but they must also rise to the occasion when the circumstances demand and a pandemic and a global emergency demands that. But parliamentarians should not be uncritical, and the challenge for the programme for government must be to move beyond strategy and policy and funding announcements and focus on effective delivery and implementation. The First Minister stated yesterday that the recommendations of the Just Transition Commission are to be accepted, and it was accompanied yesterday by the very welcome Scottish Government's response to the Just Transition Commission's report, with specific actions and commitments backed by policy and funding set out in the programme for government. Now, we face the twin pressures of COVID recovery and the drive to net zero, but unlike other countries, we do so in the context of an unmanaged and damaging Brexit. I know the government's relentless focus on mitigation of COVID impacts, but it cannot and must not constrain our drive to net zero. And the economic recovery and net zero direction, and yes, values of the country we want to be in a world that has changed so much, that future direction for our country should be in the hands of the people of Scotland with an independence referendum. And political choices matter. And we face a UK government wanting to tax the youngest and the poorest to pay for much-needed health and care funding, rather than a windfall tax on those that have profited excessively from their COVID crony contracts. Now, I represent the constituency of Linlithgow, with towns and villages across West Lothian, which have known their fair share of industrial transition, but often unfair, unjust transition. And we must learn the lessons of the past in shaping the future. And the collective pardon for minors bill will be welcomed by my constituents, just as the UK Prime Minister's crude, clumsy mischaracterisation of the demise of the mining industry in Scotland was unwelcome. Scotland needs a managed just transition to transform our energy production, distribution and use, to tackle heat and housing and transport needs in particular. And I welcome that the Scottish Energy Strategy will have just transition at its heart, and that the 10-year Economic Transformation Plan will have it embedded, and that sector plans will be part of that, and that there will be a skills guarantee for transitioning energy workers. So we need to see the mobilisation of private, not just public funding, and government can incentivise private investment through smart, bold policy and regulatory decisions in housing and transport. Presiding Officer, the programme for government has short-term immediate measures to help business recover. For example, in the very important area of tourism, it will provide continuing rates relief, very welcome amongst many tourism and hospitality sectors. £100 million for digital and business capacity. That was one of the issues that Daniel Johnson referred to and is going to be delivered as part of the programme for government. And that money for rural entrepreneurs will help revitalise different sectors with £20 million of investment. And £10 million for tourism infrastructure projects will help in order to attract more tourists to visit those areas. And importantly, listening to the business, the sector-led Tourism Recovery Task Force has put forward recommendations, and the programme for government is supporting that with £25 million to support recommendations from the industry-led Tourism Recovery Task Force. And it not only addresses the short-term pressures that people have talked about, it also addresses the long-term measures we need to secure that green economic recovery. £1.8 billion to reduce the emissions of home and building heating and to tackle fuel poverty. Bold, ambitious. £500 million for a just transition in the north east of Scotland. Vital at this point, recognising the needs and demands of that area. And yes, support for the green jobs for the future, upskilling and reskilling people. And I'm looking forward to the announcements from the Green Jobs Fund that will be coming forward shortly. And £5 billion to maintain and improve and, importantly, decarbonise, I'm just about to close, rail services. £240 million in an energy transition programme. And, Presiding Officer, yes, £1 billion for the Scottish National Investment Bank. And only yesterday, they announced £6.4 million in tidal energy company Nova Innovation, a world-class company. So, Presiding Officer, all of this in a programme for government which, yes, matches the reality of coping with immediate issues, but which has policies, funding and drive to deliver for a just transition to a net zero future. And I commend it to Parliament.
Thank you, Ms Hislop. I now call Donald Cameron to be followed by Colin Beattie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The First Minister describes her government's new partnership with the Scottish Greens is genuinely groundbreaking and a new and better way of doing politics. She argues that it provides a strong foundation for strong and decisive action. Well, yesterday's programme for government is the opposite of strong and decisive action. What is clear is that we are in for another 5 years of tired and rehashed policy and another 5 years of constitutional navel-gazing. Now, I've listened to, I think, 6 programmes for government in this chamber, and I'm always amused by the fact that SNP backbenchers are clearly told to use the words bold and ambitious to describe the new policy programme. In fact, Fiona Hislop did just that a few minutes ago when speaking in these debates, and it happens every time. Sometimes we get a bit of variety. Instead of bold and ambitious, we are treated to ambitious and bold. But just by calling it bold and ambitious doesn't make it so. And this year, as ever, the same is true. This programme for government is not bold and ambitious. It's cautious and timid. It's thin, thin gruel, Deputy Presiding Officer. Despite warm words from the First Minister on focusing on recovery from the pandemic, you barely have to read through a handful of paragraphs of the forward... I'd like to make a bit of progress. You barely have to read through a handful of paragraphs from the forward. All have listened to her in this chamber yesterday to learn of the SNP's plans to foist another referendum on Scotland at some point before 2023. Where have we heard that before? We are now in a new session of the Scottish Parliament, and this programme for government was a real opportunity to focus on the pressing need to create new jobs, to rebuild our economy, sort out the long-standing problems in our NHS, and to close the attainment gap. But instead, the SNP Green Coalition has opted to park these urgent priorities to the side, rather than delivering for communities right across Scotland. And Willie Rennie is absolutely right. He focused on delivery, and Fiona Hislop too talked about delivery. And that's the particular problem here. The words of Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, are neutral in this debate. No axe to grind, are really worth paying attention to. He said
there is a major, major implementation gap between policy ambitions and delivery on the ground. There's a mismatch between the Scottish Government's vision of a more successful Scotland, where poverty is reduced and then economic growth is sustainable, and how we assess public sector performance. And that goes beyond Brexit, beyond IndyRef 2, beyond COVID. That is the real issue. You can have the shiniest policies in the world, but if they're not delivered, it means nothing. Now, in the short-term time left that I have, I want to look at how this programme for government will impact the region that I represent and where it is missing the mark. Now, I had hoped to see concrete and deliverable policies that would help rural and remote parts of the Highlands and Islands recover from the pandemic. Because in the last 5 years, when it comes to delivery, my region has witnessed a catalogue of failures from this government, whether that be the failure to deliver 100% super-fast broadband to every home and business by the end of the last Parliament, or the failure to deliver on key infrastructure problems and help reverse the worrying trend of rural and island depopulation. But the greatest failure is this government's inability to sort out the crisis on our ferry service, which is causing misery and mayhem for residents and businesses across the Highlands and Islands. And it makes several minor commitments, this programme for government, to maintain existing policies such as RET on current routes where it's applicable, or a pledge to establish further transport integration at ferry terminals. But the glaring omission is a commitment to build any new ferries during this Parliament. The ferry network has seen ferry breakdowns on an unprecedented scale in recent months. And given over half the active ferry fleet is operating beyond its life expectancy, this would have been an ample opportunity to commit to new vessels, in addition to the 2 delayed vessels that we await. On rural depopulation, I noted that the programme for government commits to creating a rural entrepreneur fund and an islands infrastructure fund. Now, these are welcome measures, but I am concerned about whether or not this government will be able, again, to deliver on its pledges. And as I discovered recently through a parliamentary question, over the last 5 years, the SNP government passed on less than half of its rural housing fund to local authorities, less than half, and just over half of its islands housing fund. And the Shetland Islands has received nothing from the islands housing fund in the last 5 years. Now, on that basis, how can we be confident in this government to deliver on its new commitments? And the programme for government falls desperately short on infrastructure commitments. It expects that the R100 programme won't be fully delivered to homes and businesses across the North Lot area till 2027. That's 6 years away. That's a damning indictment. The SNP made a cast-iron commitment just 5 years ago that it would be delivered by this year, 2021, before this session of Parliament had begun. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I note that this programme for government makes minor commitments here and there, but it is clear to these benches that this programme for government could have said and committed to a lot more than it actually has done. Despite this government forming a coalition with the Scottish Green Party, its lack of ambition for Scotland remains static. The Scottish Conservatives have a bold commitment to deliver a number of bills in this session of Parliament, which we hope will receive support from others. But as we recover from the COVID pandemic, now is the time for fresh ideas that will stimulate our economy and create new high-quality jobs, not another divisive independence referendum that turns focus away from what really matters to the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Cameron. I now call Colin Beattie to be followed by Mercedes Villalba.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to explore some of the content of the Scottish Government's programme for government. There's much here to commend, but I do promise Mr Cameron that I shall studiously avoid the words ambitious and bold, since they offend him so much. In this short speech, I can only highlight a few of the many important initiatives detailed in that document. But since the economy is very much my priority as we come through the pandemic and face the disastrous consequences of a reckless Brexit, I'll focus on that aspect of the programme. I welcome the emphasis on a green, sustainable and prosperous recovery for all. Managing the economy at any time is a challenge. Scotland having only some of the levers by which to do so, it's too often tenuous. Relying on a Tory government in London to do the right thing by our economy, over which they have far too much negligent control, is an exercise in futility. This programme seeks to tackle those areas of the economy which we can influence and seek to strengthen and to nurture our businesses. So many businesses in our economy are struggling. The double hit of the pandemic, followed by Brexit, have left us with a fragile and uncertain economic future. Everything we can do to support our economic accelerators and to mitigate those which tend to deflate our progress must be done. I cannot deny that this would all be easier if we had control of our own future and were able to direct our own resources to the best effect. But we don't have this control, and so we must do all we can with what we have. Let me focus on the solid facts of the programme for government. Developing a well-being economy is a hugely ambitious task, especially in the situation where we are now. But the situation is also an opportunity to do things differently. Economic prosperity is essential for all our futures, and within that, the economy is an integral part of our society. And pulling together economic development, the environment and social well-being makes simple sense. I welcome the first £200 million of tranche of capital for the Scottish National Investment Bank, with a total of £1 billion over the next 5 years. The provision of patient capital to help technologies and innovative businesses is vital. Many of the technologies which we are relying on to drive net zero are not yet developed to a point where they can actually deliver the benefit hoped for. They need capital to do so. Putting in place regional economic partnerships makes absolute sense. Regional strategies and recovery plans will attract new public and private investment. New ways of working and closer cooperation between local businesses and local and national government is incredibly important. Investing an additional £500 million across this Parliament in delivering a fair, just and sustainable recovery, putting people at the forefront of economic delivery, is good news. This will support new sustainable green jobs and will help equip people to take on the new jobs of the future. And I note that £200 million will be spent on adult upskilling and retraining. This is essential as our economy settles into a new reality and a new shape. The Scottish Government established a Green Jobs Workforce Academy within its first 100 days. This will provide support for oil and gas workers, among others of course, to transition into the low-carbon sectors. Overall, this college creates the opportunity to provide a single solution for those seeking transition into green jobs. To further support this, the Green Jobs Fund will provide £100 million in capital over 5 years to help businesses create green employment through investment with opportunities to retrain and upskill in new and high-growth areas. I think you will note a heavy emphasis on retraining and upskilling throughout the entire approach to the economy and to pulling it through pandemic and Brexit. The Young Person's Guarantee has been an important and well-used scheme. The programme allocated £70 million, which combined with past investment will provide 24,000 new and enhanced opportunities for young people. Given the impact of the current economic situation, young people tend to be affected more than other demographics, so the scheme is hugely important. Fair Work's been a long-term ambition for this government. It's indeed time for all employees of companies receiving public funds to be paid the living wage, and I would also welcome the absolute abolition of zero-hour contracts in similar conditions.
Tess White.
Thank you for taking the intervention. I agree with the member about well-being and job creation and green job creation, but could the member comment on the closure and mothballing of the only wind tower manufacturer that created wind offshore and onshore turbines?
Colin Beattie.
I think that's a little bit out with the speech I'm giving at the moment. I'm sure others will touch on that. I note the commitment to exploring the possibility of a 4-day week. As a long-term private sector employer in my past life, I have some doubts about the practicality of that, but I'm certainly willing to see the evidence. I suppose one concern is that the productivity rate against GDP across the UK is poor compared to our competitors in Europe. How do we lift productivity level to meet the competition, while at the same time reducing working hours and accommodating additional productivity gains to compensate for these reduced hours? As I said, I'll await the evidence on this. Delivering a just transition will not be easy. However, it is necessary. The National Infrastructure Mission will increase investment in infrastructure by £1.6 billion by 2025-6. This should be a game changer. A key part of making this investment deliver for our economy will be the supply chains, which will enable use of these funds. And supply chains are currently under intense scrutiny, both local and international supply chains. Brexit's created a severe disruption of existing supply chains at all levels. For this investment to work, supply chain issues must be addressed. Of course, the best and quickest way to address them would be for an independent Scotland to rejoin the EU. It makes absolute economic sense. Scotland is a trading nation, and the ambition to increase exports by 25% of GDP by 2030 is laudable. Our trade balance is immeasurably better than that of the struggling UK. All this, however, has been placed under threat by Brexit. There are so many other initiatives, but there is no time to touch on more than a small number. Presiding Officer, I am pleased at the overall tenor of this programme for government. It moves Scotland in the right direction for the future. My biggest concern is that technology must move quickly, supported by the investments that we have shown. This is a document which the whole Parliament should be able to get behind and to support, and I commend it accordingly.
Thank you, Mr Beattie. I now call Mercedes Villalba to be followed by Michelle Thompson. It's up to 6 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. When I delivered my first speech in this chamber, I was clear that I came to Parliament to fight for workers in my region and across Scotland. And the reason that fight is necessary is because for too many workers, their lives are constrained by the reality of our current economic system, which enables a few to accumulate ever greater wealth at the expense of the many. Workers are increasingly undervalued and faced with low pay, insecure work and poverty. And after 14 years, the SNP have failed to offer a transformative vision for our economy. We have an economy built on declining public services, rising levels of inequality, an ever-shrinking manufacturing base, and increasingly insecure work. And this programme for government represented an opportunity for the SNP to transform our economy to address these issues. But we're instead presented with proposals which just tinker around the edges. The Scottish Government have confirmed they intend to publish a national strategy for economic transformation, a strategy which has been sorely lacking for 14 years. There was no strategy to save jobs and vital manufacturing assets when the Scottish Government stood by and allowed BiFab and the Cali railworks to be closed. And there was no strategy to promote democratic ownership of essential utilities, which are still run for private profit, not public good. Given that the climate emergency is the greatest threat facing us, I'm disappointed by the ongoing lack of ambition from the Scottish Government in this area. They promised to deliver 130,000 green jobs by this year, but the reality falls far short at just over 23,000. The First Minister has announced that a biodiversity strategy will be published by next autumn, but the programme for government appears to contradict it. I represent the North East, so I'm keen to ensure that we deliver a just transition for the region, given its dependence on the oil and gas sector for jobs and the wider local economy. Yet we do not have a green industrial base, so are forced to rely on turbine imports from Denmark, from Spain and from Germany to drive our shift to renewable energy. The programme for government refers to the creation of a £500 million Just Transition Fund for the North East and Moray, but provides absolutely no detail on how this fund will be invested. The Scottish Government pledged in 2017 to create a publicly owned energy company. This is something Scottish Labour have been calling for. But we've heard nothing on its development years later, and there's now reports that ministers are set to abandon this pledge altogether. And despite the scale of this emergency, the Scottish Government is seeking private finance and investment to deliver the green energy and technologies that we need. This is an abdication of responsibility. The Scottish Government shouldn't be outsourcing tackling the climate emergency. It should be taking a central role in coordinating Scotland's response. When it comes to tackling the fundamental issues within our economy, the Scottish Government is failing. Over 300,000 workers across Scotland are on less than the real living wage. Striking ScotRail workers are being denied pay equality, and cuts to local government are hollowing out public services. This programme for government was an opportunity to announce the real changes needed so that we can tackle the climate emergency, end inequality and bring economic power into the heart of our communities. But it's an opportunity which the Scottish Government have failed to grasp.
Thank you, Ms Villalba. I now call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Rachel Hamilton. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I, of course, welcome the programme for government as outlined by the First Minister, and in particular, for the record, the actions to ensure Scotland has the opportunity to become a modern, normal, independent nation as soon as conditions allow. For me, this is fundamentally about the freedom to make policy choices based on the needs of the Scottish people, and there are huge opportunities to be grasped. But today, I want to focus on how best to support the government's ambitions in two areas: investment in transitioning to a green economy and the need to overcome barriers to progress. The commitment to transitioning to a net zero economy is both very welcome and hugely ambitious, and it's not something government can do alone. Business must also change what they do and massively increase investment. Now, according to October 2019 data from the World Bank, significant investment in infrastructure for the next 15 years alone will be required, costing around $90 trillion by 2030. Moving away from a reliance on fossil fuels can't simply be done by stopping the use of fossil fuels. We need to invest heavily in new businesses, such as those built around hydrogen technologies. Bringing the Power to X concept to reality that I recently discussed with lead researchers at St Andrews University is a case in point, and particularly important for my constituency of Falkirk East that includes Grangemouth. The United Nations has claimed that if our investment patterns do not change, we're on course for a 3.5-degree rise in global temperatures that will be devastating for our planet. They point, for example, to the need for pension funds and investors to move quickly and at scale to decarbonise their portfolios. For us, this must include how we leverage pensions investments in support of the government's ambitions. We're better than to start at home. I was disappointed to read in Business Insider back in April of this year that our Parliamentary Pension Fund had not, at that time, fully divested itself of fossil fuel investments. Having looked at the 32 Scottish local authority pension funds, almost £50 billion in total is currently being invested by 11 regional funds. Strathclyde and Lothian are the largest and the most developed in terms of climate investment practice. All funds, to some degree, acknowledge the need to address net zero ambitions, but there's some distance to travel. So I was pleased to note in the Scottish Government's response to the Just Transition Commission that they plan to develop guidelines for voluntary disclosure. My own personal view is that as soon as possible that should be required, given the issues with the comply and explain, where often it's more often explain in terms of corporate governance. There is, however, some good news, and it's twofold. Internationally, the World Bank, amongst others, has identified that transitioning to a green economy can unlock new economic opportunities and jobs. An investment of £1 is likely on average to yield £4 in benefits, it claims. Second, and because of Scotland's existing progress with renewable energy and our other natural advantages, we are ideally placed to exploit the new opportunities that will create many more jobs in the future. But economically, it's not all sweetness and light, thanks to the current UK government. As we look towards the future, we find a toxic combination of Brexit and the Internal Market Act creating barriers to progress. As recent research by the Fraser of Allender Institute and others has pointed out in relation to the Internal Market Act, and I quote, "The effect is to circumvent not only the Barnett formula but the devolved governments themselves." Part of the UK government response to Brexit has been to set up funds that are aimed at addressing lost EU structural funds. But whereas the Scottish Government, our Scottish Government, was in the past able to assess needs and set appropriate priorities, the UK Government's replacement funds currently bypass the Scottish Government, setting up a competitive bidding process for local authorities. Interesting. The lead department managing this competition will be England's Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. I'm wondering whether that's what Liz Smith meant in earlier comments about the good news that it won't actually be an English minister bypassing our elected Scottish Parliament. I think that speaks volumes. I'm not aware that such a ministry has any expertise to assess Scottish needs. So the lesson here has to be that until we achieve Scottish independence, we will always be at the mercy of the whims of a Tory government in Westminster who fundamentally don't put Scotland's interests at heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Thompson. I now call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Maggie Chapman. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding. Can you hear me? Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday's programme for government announcement was incredibly disappointing, especially for rural Scotland. It jeopardises rural jobs, rehashes old announcements and fails to tackle the urgent need for action in rural communities as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. What it does prioritise, however, and it only takes the reader until page 4 to work this out, is the SNP Green obsession with independence and breaking up Britain at the time of crisis. This programme puts their campaign for separation front and centre above recovery from the pandemic, which is nothing short of reckless. Today in the Chamber, the Health Secretary took questions from MSPs worried about their constituents who cannot see a GP. This week in my constituency, the practice of Coldingham was shut. And it's just another rural practice that's been shut, another one on the list, because this government has failed to attract GPs to rural areas. We heard concerns in the First Minister's statement about rising COVID cases, yet the Nationalist Coalition will pursue a white paper on independence, diverting time and resource away from the things that matter to the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, whilst there are policies within the programme for government that benefit rural areas, it falls at the first hurdle when tackling the deep-rooted problems facing rural communities. I welcome, for example, the increased funding for more women in agriculture. However, there are questions to ask about how this will encourage diversity or lower the age of farmers who currently sits at 59 with the legislation that they're proposing to bring forward on succession planning. The agri-tourism growth strategy, that's fantastic, and it's taken straight from the Scottish Conservative policy, Presiding Officer. One may debate whether a souffle should be reheated, but these are old ideas rehashed. The Rural Entrepreneur Fund is simply a rebadged Rework SNP 2021 manifesto commitment. Their manifesto said they will create a new £20 million Rural Entrepreneur Fund. Now, the Nationalist Coalition programme for government says in the coming financial year we will launch a £20 million Rural Entrepreneur Fund. I think that's the same thing. The fundamental fact remains. Yes.
Ivan McKee.
Misunderstands the purpose of a manifesto and a programme for government. The manifesto says what we're going to do, and the programme for government brings it into the Chamber to debate those points. So did she expect us to put things in the manifesto and then not deliver them?
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Ivan McKee, for that intervention. But I mean, I can just go on with the list, and I will do within my speech, of the rehashed and reworked commitments that have been promised and failed to be delivered by your government. The fundamental fact remains the central belt-focused SNP Green government has simply missed the point when it comes to the rural recovery, leaving Scotland's farmers on the scrap heap. For example, they make calls to double land for organic farming, but between 2012 and 2019, organic land decreased under this government by 40%. 40%, Presiding Officer, and stands currently at 1.6% of total Scottish land. This government are not listening to rural Scotland. Why have the SNP not acted on their own commissioned research which highlights widespread abuse of Scottish gamekeepers? Why is there no reference to the scourge of fly tipping, which injures wildlife and farm animals, and which my colleague Murdo Fraser will bring a bill to tackle this in this Parliament? Take the SNP obsession with bringing Scotland back in line with deeply unpopular EU regulation. Farmers across the country whooped with delight at the prospect of leaving this cumbersome, bureaucratic, red tape-ridden CAP regime with its 3-crop rule and land-based payments rather than meaningful interventions to drive productivity and inefficiency. Due to the desire to align with CAP, Scotland is put at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the UK because our internal market is worth 3 times that of the EU. Where is the draft Farming and Food Production Policy Group report? It's still in draft format. It's not been published. And that actually highlights the dismay that those individuals have with CAP and the fact that delivering environmental objectives with payments levels not always correlating clearly with public benefits. Further to this, the SNP's proposed realignment with the EU's controversial regime for pesticide regulation is a massive worry for farmers. We've seen before the debacle over glyphosate, and we cannot afford, in our fight against climate change and food sustainability, to leave decision-making to Brussels. We know that gene editing reduces the need for application of pesticides, which in turn would help the Scottish Government's poor biodiversity record and help the agricultural sector meet climate change targets. As the country moves towards net zero in the coming decades, the agricultural sector has been identified as a sector that can lead the way in tackling climate change. But moving forward, Presiding Officer, with the newly announced Ministers for Zero Carbon, Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights and Green Skills, the Circular Economy and Biodiversity taking up their positions, I've been left to wonder when the Government are going to unveil the next Minister for Compost, Country Bumpkins and the Winter Solstice, adding to the burgeoning number of SPADs and civil servants paid by the taxpayer. Fundamentally, this programme for government is designed to meet green demands and prop up numbers to push an agenda to break up Britain, effectively a one-trick disaster duo. And to build on Donald Cameron's point on delivery, one might ponder if the Greens' U-turn on vaccine passports set a precedent for future dealings, that they will be happy to sit back when their new partners fail to deliver on rural housing targets, island depopulation, ferries, job creation and the economy. Presiding Officer, there's no mention of infrastructure. There's no mention of the things that matter to people in the rural economy. And I know that my time's up, so I shall leave it there. But the Scottish Conservatives are the only ones who can deliver for rural Scotland.
Thank you. I call Maggie Chapman to be followed by Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What is our economy for? What are the values that underpin it? And what do we need to do to support the kind of economy we want? These are 3 of the fundamental questions, I think, that any government must ask when considering how to govern, what legislation, policies and strategies should make up their programme for government. I have spoken here before about how the Scottish Greens seek to address these questions. We want our economy to serve society, to create the context within which all members of society can reach their potential. Such an economy must be based on care, creativity and cooperation, not driven by the profit motive. The fallout of the 2008 financial crisis and the current economic shock of the pandemic have demonstrated the failings of conventional economics that Liz Smith was talking about earlier, and the pursuit of endless economic growth. We understand that mathematically, never mind ethically, you cannot have infinite growth in a finite system without that system collapsing. So, as we rebuild our economy, we must grasp the opportunity to do things differently, to reorient our economy so that it can support everyone to have what they need to live a good life, whilst supporting society to respect our planetary boundaries. We have, I think, already begun this journey, and this programme for government is Scotland's next step. It is not perfect. It does not do everything that we might wish it to. It does not, for instance, go as far as I'd like in challenging assumptions of industrial strategy. The advice provided on Ferguson's shipyard and BIFAB has not been good enough. We need to look for advice from other sources. It also does not, indeed it cannot, go as far as many of us in this chamber would like, because we do not have all the economic levers at our disposal. Given the powers of independence, we could see a plan, a Scottish Meidner plan, if you will, to give workers progressively more ownership of the economy. We would also be able to maximise the enormous potential in a Scottish green industrial revolution. We know we have the expertise and history to lead the way in heavy industry, manufacturing and engineering. But there are key shifts in thinking in the programme for government that give me hope. Because we know that the same things we need to tackle the climate emergency are what we need to support economic recovery from COVID. Investment in public transport, job creation, and we can do that upgrading Scotland's homes, building up our renewables industry. Our recovery must be investment-led. That the UK government wants to cut spending by at least 5% across all departments is terrifying. We cannot cut our way to success, to resilience, to prosperity. The Scottish Government must invest and is committed to investing and playing an active role in developing and growing green industries and ensuring workers and wealth redistribution are at the heart of our recovery plans. At the heart of this programme for government is a commitment to a green economic recovery based on the policies and expenditure plans agreed in the cooperation deal between the Greens and the Scottish Government. This deal will mean billions of public money invested in green industries and determined action to ensure that public funds do everything they can to support positive outcomes for workers and the environment. Investing in energy efficiency is the cheapest and most effective way of creating green jobs and reducing emissions. The Green Cooperation Deal will see at least £1.8 billion in making Scotland's homes and buildings more efficient, tackling fuel poverty and creating new jobs and opportunities for builders, roofers, plumbers, heating engineers, joiners, window fitters and so many more. This is tried and tested. Energy efficiency investment from Germany to South Korea was central to their recovery from the 2008 financial crash. We will also see the start of the investment of £5 billion in improving, expanding and decarbonising our railways to deliver a modern, reliable and zero-carbon train service, as well as major economic benefits. For every £1 billion invested in the sector, £1.6 billion is generated and 14,000 jobs created. Regional rail links, including rural rail links, like that, I must make progress, like that to be developed as a result of the cooperation agreement in the North East, in my region, linking Peterhead and Fraserburgh to Aberdeen, will play a vital role supporting local economic development. Just look at the Borders Railway, which has carried millions of passengers. Carry on.
Rachel Hamilton. I very much thank Maggie Chapman for taking an intervention. To create rural jobs, extending the railway down to Carlisle from Tweed Bank would be a game changer. Does the member support that?
Maggie Chapman.
Thank you. I think we need to look at rail infrastructure in all regions across Scotland because, yes, I think it is the future of transport connectivity. It's the future of community connectivity too. Because we know, looking at the Borders Railway, which has carried millions of passengers since opening and attracted investment and tourism to the area, this is a real way to generate economic sustainability. I'm going to make progress, if you don't mind. The deal will also see billions more invested in the onshore wind industry, in addition to the rapidly growing offshore sector. And Greens will seek to ensure that this investment creates jobs and opportunities in the supply chain too. We cannot continue to see our domestic manufacturing fail while turbines are imported. Finally, the Green Deal will see conditionality applied to all Scottish Government support, so that public money is always forwarding the just transition and promoting fair work. This includes requirements to pay the real living wage, recognise trade unions, and ensure recipients of public grants are not engaging in tax avoidance. This is what investment-led recovery looks like, and it is the economic recovery that people and planet need. And while I'm proud of the difference the Greens are making, we need to do more. TUC analysis of public spending on the green recovery and job creation in the G7 countries shows that the UK is lagging far, far behind, with Germany investing 3 times more per person and France 4 times more. While we are here in Scotland doing what we can, we need the UK government to do their bit too, to reject austerity, to commit to a long-term programme of green stimulus spend.
Could the member wind up, please?
I will do. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Failure to invest in a green economic recovery, would be a disaster for our planet and for our economy. So we have our work to do. But the prize will be a prosperous, successful and resilient economy that supports a fair and green Scotland.
I call Evelyn Tweed, the last speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the programme for government and, in particular, the commitment to an independence referendum, which, and this is always worth repeating, the people of Scotland voted for. It's also worth repeating that Scotland has been dragged out of the EU against the wishes of its people by a party that hasn't won an election here since 1955. The Scottish Government is to be praised for stopping work on the independence referendum last year to focus on the pandemic, whilst the UK Government pressed ahead with a disastrous Brexit. It is absolutely clear that becoming an independent country is essential to building the Scotland that we know is possible and allow us to rejoin the EU. Scotland simply... No, thank you. I need to make progress. Scotland simply cannot afford to be part of a UK that is intent on destroying its economic base. We see shortages of labour and increased complexity in European trade. Take, for example, a small business in the heart of Stirling, the Scottish Gantry. They have spoken about their customs nightmares. They say they have had great difficulty securing wine imports and exporting whisky products. They are drowning in paperwork and red tape. This is a damning indictment of the Westminster Government, who have betrayed Scotland's many world-class businesses with their Brexit obsession. And it's good to see Kate Forbes press the UK Government on these issues. Presiding Officer, there is so much in the programme for government to be commended, but there are 3 areas that I particularly want to highlight. Having spent a career in housing and building housing for people in need, I welcome the continuing expansion of the Affordable Supply Programme, with a further £3.5 billion of investment and the building of an additional 110,000 new homes. Since 2007, over 1,700 social and affordable homes have been built in the Stirling constituency, and over the next 5 years, a further £53 million will be invested. The SNP Government continue to transform areas like the Raploch, which were abandoned under Labour, into attractive, vibrant communities. And it's thanks to the SNP Government and its abolition of the right to buy policy that councils are now able to build new homes, supporting the investment and the excellent work of 150 housing associations that work right across Scotland. Building new homes is vital for our economy, creating high-quality jobs, apprenticeships, whilst improving the health, the well-being and the life chances of our communities. And that brings me on to the next aspect of the programme that is to be very welcomed. There are numerous references in the programme to support for jobs, businesses, the high street and our tourism sector. You would not know from the comments of the opposition parties, but Scotland under the SNP Government has an excellent record in increasing and supporting employment. Unemployment in Scotland currently stands at 4.3%, below the UK average of 4.7% and well below the London figure of 6.2%. Finally, Presiding Officer, I welcome the pardon of the miners across Scotland, as Fiona Hislop has, including those in my constituency in Bannockburn and the Eastern Villages. The vicious and vindictive actions of the Thatcher government obliterated an entire industry almost overnight. Many experts feel that there is a particular link between problem drug use, poverty and inequality caused by the UK's rapid deindustrialisation. The loss of these industries and the complete lack of any strategy to replace them destroyed communities. The Scottish Government is still having to deal with the legacy of that industrial vandalism. Listening to the contributions in the Chamber, it's clear that many opposition members want to ignore the problems that their parties have created for Scotland. The Scottish Government already spends far too much time and resources mitigating the impact of UK government policies. It now also has to try and mitigate all the negative consequences of Brexit. And now, at the worst possible time, the UK Government are introducing a tax on jobs with the increase in national insurance to pay for social care reforms in England. The Liberal Democrats want us to forget their enthusiastic role in imposing austerity in Scotland, which was really just an excuse to cut public spending and tax the poor. And we can't forget that the Labour Party really had the power to transform the whole of the UK between 1997 and 2010. And instead of... No, I'm about to finish, but thank you. And instead of, for example, tackling inequality, poverty and homelessness, the Labour government kept the House of Lords, spent billions of pounds on the Iraq war, which cost millions of lives, and bailed out the bankers with billions of pounds of public money. And of course, Labour recently voted for Johnson's supposedly oven-ready Brexit. In closing, Presiding
Members,
Officer,
I cannot hear Ms Tweed. I'd like to do so. I'd be grateful for your cooperation.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In closing, Presiding Officer, I welcome this ambitious programme for government and in particular its commitment to giving our people the right to choose their future and the opportunity to build a fairer, greener and more sustainable economy for everyone in Scotland and those that come after us. Thank you.
Thank you. We move to winding up speeches and I call on Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The pandemic is first and foremost a health crisis, but it's also fast become an economic one. Too many lives and livelihoods have been lost, and still today families fear for the health of their loved ones, for their jobs, for their incomes. Never before has it been more important for this Parliament, for this Government, to step up to the mark. But this programme for government fails to do that. It lacks urgency. The First Minister's statement yesterday was littered with references to in the lifetime of this Parliament, except, of course, the Coalition's real priority of another independence referendum the Government want within months. At a time this Parliament, this Government should be focused laser-like on delivering a national recovery plan from COVID, on health, on schools, on the environment and on the economy. Nothing should distract from that focus. As Willie Rennie rightly highlighted, it will take a long time to deliver the recovery we need. The programme for government is long on rhetoric about that recovery, but it's short on detail and a plan to deliver it. There are many worthwhile individual initiatives in the programme. Some are worthwhile, but as Daniel Johnson said, the announcements are either retreads or so inconsequential that they barely scratch the surface. There's no overarching thread, no clear aims, no immediate strategy, and taken together, those initiatives do not go far enough. Presiding Officer, we can't wait until the publication of a 10-year economic strategy. There are currently 32,000 young people out of work in Scotland right now. That figure has risen sharply in the past year as young people face the challenge of entering the labour market in the midst of a pandemic, often in sectors hit hardest and where government support failed to match what was needed, like retail, hospitality, tourism. The number of new modern apprenticeships... I'll take an intervention, yeah.
Minister. Member not recognise the work on the Young Persons Guarantee, addressing the very specific point he made there about youth unemployment.
Colin Smith.
The problem that Ivan Mackay has is the young person's guarantee doesn't do what it says on the tin. It doesn't guarantee real opportunities for all those 32,000 young people. No, your own programme of government talks about 24,000 opportunities. There are 32,000 young people unemployed at this moment in time. Young people who have, I have to say, an SNP Green government that still thinks 0 hours contracts are a positive destination. Frankly, we need an ambitious... I'll take an intervention on that point. Yeah.
Minister.
It was Labour and the Smith Commission that prevented the devolution of employment law. Otherwise, we would have fixed that some time ago.
I appreciate that Mr Mackay fails to ever take any responsibility for the powers he actually does have, but you, Minister, and your government constantly refer to 0 hour contracts as a positive destination. Now, why do you continue to do that? It shows a lack of support for actually getting rid of 0 hour contracts. We need, Presiding Officer, an ambitious job scheme that delivers a real guarantee of a job, of training, of education for every single one of Scotland's young and long-term unemployed. With furlough coming to an end, which currently supports 141,000 jobs in Scotland, and again often in those sectors with a high proportion of young people, that figure for youth unemployment may rise further, or at the very least is not going to fall sharply because of this government's programme for government. And we need to make sure that the talents, the skills of our young people match where opportunities and vacancies do and will arise in the future. The number of vacancies fell sharply in recent years compared to prior to the pandemic. According to the Scottish Government's own employer skills survey last year, there were half the vacancies that existed in 2017. But even then, employers described a quarter of vacancies as hard to fill due to a skills shortage. As the number of vacancies increase, not just through new demand as we open up the economy again, but increasing automation, reports of labour shortages are growing almost across the board, from farming to HGV drivers, partly because of Brexit and the barriers to overseas labour, but also because of the multitude of structural factors that go beyond our exit from the EU. There's a difference between a labour shortage and a skills shortage, but we won't tackle the former in the long term if we don't do more to tackle the latter now. There's much in the Government's Future of Skills Action Plan that's hard to disagree with, but again there was little new in the programme of government to ensure that the scale of the response matches the scale of either the labour or skills gap challenge we face. No wonder that in their response to the programme for government, the CBI in Scotland said employers will be frustrated not to hear more about plans for upskilling and retraining. That lack of urgency and scale was also reflected in the SNP Green Government's response to the report of the Just Transition Commission. Fiona Hislop described it as welcome, but the STUC said it leaves much to be desired on future jobs creation and ensuring the burden of climate change is not carried by workers and the less well-off. As Mercedes Villalba said, it shows little has changed since the SNP promised 130,000 green jobs by 2020, but instead cut the number of people directly employed to just over 23,000. The Cabinet Secretary in her contribution referred to the Scottish Government's £100 million Greens Jobs Fund, but that was announced almost a year ago and it is yet to create a single job. As Daniel Johnson and Mercedes Villalba asked, what's happened to the plans to establish a publicly owned energy company? In June, the leader of the Scottish Greens attacked the SNP for not moving quick enough on the plan, yet today is part of a government that appears to have just ditched it altogether. The programme for government could have put climate, not just the Constitution first, with a real plan for a just transition, focused on developing the skills needed in the green recovery and protecting jobs in communities impacted by the transition to net zero. But it has not done so. And, Presiding Officer, one other area I want to briefly highlight where we need to go further than the programme of government does is on the future of our town centres. Walk through any high street at the moment and the fastest growing market you'll see is in providers to to-let signs. Shop closures have accelerated the past year, but our high streets have been in decline for a lot longer. We can't wait until the proposed retail strategy sometime in the future. We need an immediate fiscal stimulus package to encourage people back safely into our shops and to prevent lockdown behaviours from embedding permanently. The lifting of restrictions in the government's Loves Local Fund and the loyalty card, welcome and laudable as they are, do not scratch the surface of the plummeting footfall our town centres have faced. We can and should go further with a meaningful high street voucher scheme by providing a level playing field between bricks and mortar shops and online retailers through properly reforming business rates. And we need to think out of the box when it comes to our high streets, for example, investing in getting more people living in our town centres again. Presiding Officer, as we face up to the uncertainty of what the current third COVID wave might mean, lives and livelihoods are still on the line and businesses are still on the brink. But we can generally build back better if we make the right choices by supporting businesses more now to get through the crisis and by investing to create stronger, more inclusive, more resilient and greener economies. However, we need a Parliament and a Government that is relentlessly focused on the issues that will matter over the next few years, a Parliament and Government that will always put the recovery first, not another independence referendum.
I call Murdo Fraser. Up to 8 minutes, Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In presenting the programme for government yesterday, the First Minister and her team had a very simple choice to make. They could bring forward a set of proposals that would unite this chamber and the wider country, that would focus on what was important, or they could decide instead to focus on measures that would divide us. And it must be a matter of great regret that they chose the second option. Now, it was entirely clear in advance of today's debate what the priorities for Scotland are at this point. We have to see a focus on economic recovery, as Liz Smith set out earlier this afternoon, helping replace the jobs that have been lost, helping support businesses which have suffered so much over the past 18 months. And we have to see a focus on rebuilding our public services, helping our NHS, which we know is creaking at the seams, and repairing the damage done to the lives of our young people due to them missing education over the past 18 months. Sorry, who's that? Oh, yes, I'll go away.
Michelle Thompson.
Now, the member opening for the Tories declined my opportunity to deny that the Minister for Housing, Communities and Local Government for England would lead the overruling of this democratic Scottish Parliament in the signing structural funds. Perhaps the member might want to deny that instead.
Murdo Fraser.
Scotland has two governments. It has a government here and a government in Westminster. And both governments should be working together for the good of people of Scotland. And I would say to Michelle Thompson, I hope if the UK government decides to start spending money in her constituency, she's not going to turn that money away and say we don't want that money. I hope she would welcome it on behalf of her constituents, because that would be the sensible thing to do. So sadly, Presiding Officer, I've been trying to set out some of the issues that should have been addressed, and sadly I think yesterday's programme for government did too little to address these issues. And the voices of Scotland's businesses were very clear as to where the priority should have been. The Chief Executive of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, Liz Cameron, said that supporting business recovery must be at the front and centre of the government's priorities. And we agree with that. There needed to be a bold plan for jobs recovery, with a target from the government on the number of new jobs that could be created. Earlier in the debate, Daniel Johnson made a very fair point about the need for action now. We've heard a lot about long-term plans over 5 years. We can't afford to wait. We need action to start now, because we want to see the Scottish economy growing faster than anywhere else in the United Kingdom, rather than lagging behind. And instead, this new SNP Green coalition... Yeah, I'll go away.
Minister.
Does know that Scotland's economy has rebounded faster than that of the rest of the UK, back to pre-pandemic levels.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, that may have been the case over the last month or two, Presiding Officer, but the long-term trend is very clear. The long-term trend is we've been lagging behind the United Kingdom, as the member will know if he'd done his homework. And we have a First Minister who has appointed... No, look, I've taken 2 interventions already. I'll make some progress. I'll give way to the member later if I have some time. Because the First Minister has appointed people to her government to hold ministerial office who are actively hostile to the principle of economic growth. And it's little wonder, therefore, that those business voices who were once enthusiastic supporters of the SNP are so dismissive of the approach now being taken. Only at the weekend we saw Jim McCall, once the Yes campaign's biggest cheerleader, saying how badly let down he had been by this government and how he felt used by them. We also saw Sir George Matheson, former chairman of the Scottish Government's Council of Economic Advisers, another enthusiastic SNP and Yes campaign supporter, expressing his concern about the power-sharing deal with the Greens and saying, in his words, this raises concerns about whether the contribution of business is still valid. So that's the business reaction, not the reaction from pro-union business people, but the reaction from people who pinned their colours to the SNP mast. That's their reaction to what this government is doing, and there's nothing in this programme that will reassure them. So instead of seeing proposals that will take Scotland forward and unite us, instead we see proposals that will divide us. We see proposed a bill to reform the Gender Recognition Act, a proposal so contentious that just last week we saw one of the largest ever demonstrations outside this Parliament, with hundreds of women from all... Oh, the First Minister saying shame on me, dismissing the concerns of hundreds of women from across Scotland who came outside this Parliament to express their concerns. She's saying shame on them. What a disgrace, First Minister. You are not listening to the concerns of these women. Now, we await seeing the detail of this bill, but on these benches we're absolutely clear that women's rights must be protected in the context of GRA reform, and I know these concerns are shared by many on the SNP benches too. And then we see proposals to bring forward a national care agency, which amount to what has already been described as a blatant power grab from local authorities. COSLA have complained they were given just a few hours' notice of the huge scope of the overhaul of public service being proposed, not just adult social care, but children's services, community justice, alcohol and drug services, social work, and elements of mental health services, all to be centralised, all to be brought under Edinburgh control, rather than decisions taken at a local level. Presiding Officer, we know this is a government that continually demands that powers be passed down to it from Westminster, but it's a government that likes hoarding power here at Holyrood. In Scotland, it wants to strip powers away from local authorities and build empires for Scottish ministers. That is not something we can support. It is about dividing Scotland when we should be uniting. But by far the worst proposal, Presiding Officer, and the most divisive, is the one we see on preparations for another independence referendum. Because it's hard to imagine anything more damaging, more out of touch with the public mood, more disdainful of the concerns of business than to be pursuing another divisive referendum at this particular point in our history when the country faces so many other challenges. It is a misuse of public resources to divert the time of civil servants away from other vital work to focus on this. We know the public don't want another referendum. We know there is not support for it, just as there is not support for independence. It is an obsession of this party in government and this First Minister to pursue the breaking up of the United Kingdom when there are so many other priorities.
Can I, Mr Fraser, can I please ask that we desist from sedentary comments? Thank you. I'd like to hear Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And what is worse is that these plans for a referendum bill at some point in the future are utterly pointless, because holding a constitutional referendum, as we all agreed in 2014, is out with the powers of this Parliament. We would waste parliamentary time on a bill that will go nowhere, that is all about stirring division, that allows a First Minister to grandstand to her party faithful when she knows, and we know, and they know, she has absolutely no ability to deliver on that objective. It is, in the simplest of terms, a total and utter waste of parliamentary and Scottish Government time. But there is one thing I do agree with the First Minister, and that is when she said that a new case for independence is needed. Because the one that was presented in 2014 is now exposed as a work of fiction, whether on oil, on Scotland's finances or on currency. Even the person who led that campaign, the former First Minister, the man whose name can no longer be mentioned, has been airbrushed out of SNP history. And now we have the SNP's shiny new signing, their latest economic guru, Professor Mark Blythe, setting out the hard realities of independence. In his words, quoted by Liz Smith earlier, it would be Brexit times 10. This is not a unionist politician saying this. It's not even a non-aligned academic. It is this government's newly appointed Chief Economic Advisor, a cheerleader and supporter of a separate Scotland, saying that, in his view, independence would be 10 times more damaging than Brexit. So every time we hear someone on the SNP benches, and we heard it in the debate this afternoon, Presiding Officer, mumping and moaning about Brexit, or blaming supply chain issues exclusively on Brexit, let's remind them what their own expert says about it. It would be 10 times more damaging to go down the route of independence. Presiding Officer, just to conclude, it is shameful that that is the priority of this government at this particular time. It is all too typical of an administration that is out of ideas, an administration that would divide us rather than unite us. It has nothing new to offer the people of Scotland. This programme for government is one that should be rejected.
Thank you. I call on Ivan Mackay to wind up the debate. Minister, up to 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I'll take a few minutes, as is customary, to go round and comment on some of the comments that have been made this afternoon. If I won't have time to get round everything in the time available. So I think really just to close off on the point that Liz Smith made, every other country in the world borrowed to get through COVID. Scotland would have been no different where we're an independent country. Let's get that nailed. It's hugely important. And the point that Murdo Fraser made, he can't resist himself talking down Scotland's economy at every opportunity. The facts are, if you've done your homework, you'd know this. In the period from pre-pandemic, February 2020, until now, Scotland's economy down 2.1%, UK economy down 2.2%. And if we look at unemployment, a point made by some of my colleagues in the Chamber this afternoon as well, Scotland's unemployment at the moment 4.2%, the rest of the UK 4.7%. So still work to do, but if you want to talk about comparisons with us and the rest of the UK, we are at the moment doing better. Daniel Johnson talks about business engagement. I can tell him I talk to businesses every single day of the week, and I had 2 meetings with businesses this morning before I came to the Chamber to deliver the speech here this afternoon. And if you talk to businesses, they talk about those labour market shortages and they talk about the issues that are affecting them. We recognise that, we understand that. We've got businesses engaged in the work we are doing on the National Economic Strategy. They recognise the value of that. They recognise, as he did and he changed his position, the importance of having a long-term strategy to be able to address these issues, and that's exactly what we are doing. Yes, I will.
Daniel Johnson.
I hear what they're saying, and I don't doubt he has those meetings, but is he listening? Because the reality is in a few short weeks, 150,000 people, as were on furlough, are going to find themselves having to go back into employment. Surely there needs to at least be a contingency if those people's jobs are no longer there for them. And where is that in the programme for government? Where is the contingency?
Minister.
I think it was the £500 million in skills investment I talked about, and the whole range of other interventions I talked about, where we're supporting people to get back into work. Because the reality is, at the moment, we are facing both a labour market shortages in every single sector across the economy, and we have people that we need to work with to get them the opportunity to take up those opportunities. So if he talks to businesses the way I do, he would understand that the labour market shortage is the biggest issue that they've got. Willie Rennie talks about that as well. Talks about the high the wages that's driven. We also welcome that, and I want to say some more on that as I go through in my remarks, and the efforts that we're taking proactively to embed that in our economic strategy. And he talks about material shortages, shortage of HGV drivers in logistics, driven largely by Brexit. We are working hard to influence UK government where we can on many aspects, including visas for those drivers to come in and support our industries, and working hard with the construction sector and others at a very detailed level to address those material shortages that are affecting businesses right across Scotland. Fiona Hislop made some very valid points, and this reinforces, in 1 minute, and very valid points. This reinforces my point about a very strong engagement with business, the Tourism Recovery Group, the Recovery Task Force, the work that they came forward with in conjunction with government, £25 million of support identified and invested to support that, and now we're moving on to look at phase 2 proposals from that group.
Willie Rennie.
Interview. No, it was Willie Rennie. On you go.
I want to thank the Minister for giving me, and I know he does engage with business, and he's assisted me with many businesses in my constituency. But all the things that he said about the disruption, in part, that's been caused by Brexit, does that not give him some thought about the disruption that would inevitably come with independence?
Minister.
Independence will create opportunities, and I'm going to come on and talk to that in my comments as I go forward. I don't have much to say about Donald Cameron. It was bold, but I'm afraid not ambitious. Other members have talked about the real living wage and the importance of that. I remind Labour members that if they hadn't had that ridiculous position in the Smith Commission, we'd already have dealt with this issue through the devolution of employment law. But Colin Beattie raised this and others. The programme for government has a very strong commitment on conditionality, something I'm delighted to take forward with regards to real living wage and other aspects of the Fair Work First agenda. And our Green Ports agenda that we are taking forward will be one of the first areas where we'll embed that conditionality to lift their wages right across this country. Mercedes Villalba talked about apparently Labour now doesn't support private sector investment in the economy. Who knew? So a very interesting policy shift there. That £3 billion green investment portfolio is precisely to attract international investment investment and to invest in our green transition towards net zero, along with the public sector investment. You need both of those to deliver on this. A point Michelle Thompson made very well in her comments, that £3 billion green investment portfolio and locking that investment a part of our global capital investment plan, alongside the work of the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, really setting up Scotland as a centre for ESG investment, something that we're very proud to take forward. Maggie Chapman talked about conditionality, and I already covered that, and then point about investment in infrastructure, and made the very strong point that we need the powers to do that, as did my colleague Evelyn Tweed. So moving on from that, Presiding Officer, to conclusion. How many minutes have I got left? 3, 4. Okay. This debate's been about our programme for government, a programme that recognises the central importance of Scotland's economy to our recovery and transformation, and it recognises this government's commitment to supporting and working with businesses the length and breadth of this country. Because, Presiding Officer, this government is unashamedly pro-business. We understand the need to grow Scotland's economy, to create prosperity, to fund our public services, and to create those opportunities for all of Scotland's people to realise their potential. And we understand the need for that growth to be completely aligned with our overriding twin imperatives of delivering net zero and delivering on our Fair Work agenda. We understand that productivity is the key to a successful economy. We recognise that a well-being economy, providing opportunities and prosperity for all of Scotland's people, is built on a strong, productive economy. Presiding Officer, the range of measures detailed in this programme make that clear. There are initiatives to strengthen the skills pipeline that our growth businesses need, to support workers transitioning to low-carbon sectors or those entering the labour market for the first time. There are initiatives to support investment in the economy, public sector investment in our public services and infrastructure, and to intelligently stimulate private sector investment in our growth businesses and wider economy. Our initiatives to support entrepreneurship across all sectors of our population, and specifically targeted at key groups, women, rural entrepreneurs and others. Our initiatives to further internationalise our economy and drive up exports, despite the vandalism inflicted on it by the UK Government's misguided Brexit policies. But, Presiding Officer, this programme also delivers on our wider ambitions for Scotland, the just transition to net zero, contributing to the global efforts to address the climate emergency, and to create a fair work nation, a country where everyone is paid at least the real living wage. We work with businesses, sector groups, regional economic partnerships across the country to deliver on those ambitions, to create a high productivity, high innovation, high technology, high wage economy. We all want to see an economy that works for everyone. But, Presiding Officer, it also recognises the limitations of our current powers on investment, employment law, international trade and elsewhere. And so rightly it calls for the people of Scotland to have a say in whether all of those powers should come to this Parliament as an independent country, and that is the opportunity that will create for those businesses in Scotland. Presiding Officer, our national strategy for economic transformation will be published later this year. As the Cabinet Secretary has made clear, this will be a national endeavour, co-produced with stakeholders across the country and implemented alongside businesses and others. It will build on top of the initiatives in this programme for government and will be an ambitious 10-year agenda to transform Scotland's economy. Presiding Officer, I look forward to working with businesses and others across the country to deliver that bold and ambitious agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Programme for Government 2021-22 Economy. It is now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Business Motion 1143 in the name of George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a change to this week's business. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press their request to speak button now. And I call on George Adam to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and formally moved.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 1143 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 1111 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I call on George Adam to move the motion.
Once again, Presiding Officer, moved.
The question is that motion 1111 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 1112 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on Stage 1 timetable for a bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press their request to speak button now. And I call on George Adam to move the motion.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
No member has asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 1112 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The next item of business is consideration of 9 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and I ask George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move motions 1113, 1114, 1115 and 1117 to 1120 on approval of SSIs, 1121 on committee membership and 1122 on committee substitutions.
Moved, Presiding Officer. I'm quite happy to go into detail on the SSIs if you wish.
Minister, if you would wish to, but we
Not that I would prefer to wish to, but just I was giving you the option.
I think, Minister, given that you have offered the Chamber that option, you should continue.
Let's hear you. Once again, Presiding Officer, everyone's favourite time of the evening. The first SSI is the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Amendment number 13. Regulations 2021 SSI 2021-237 came into force on the 14th of June and is extended to definitions for elite sport to include all events at which specified persons compete to qualify for the Birmingham Commonwealth Games. The next one is Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 27, Regulations 2021, SSI 2021-238, came into force on the 11th of June. It included providing a person designated by a local authority with a power of entry to enforce restrictions relating to stadia and events. And the next one is the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 28, Regulations 2021 SSI 2021-242, came into force on the 18th of June. It included removing Ireland and Bedford Borough Council from the list of areas to which common travel area restrictions apply. Following that is the Health Protection Coronavirus Restriction and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 29. Regulations 2021 SSI 2021-252 came into force on the 26th of June. It included adjusting physical distance requirements in various settings, including funerals. The Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 30, Regulations 2021 SSI 2021-255 came into force on the 30th of June. It included removing the areas of Bolton Metropolitan Borough Council from the list of areas of which common travel area restrictions apply. The Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 31, Regulations 2021, SSI 2021-262, came into force on the 8th of July. It included reducing required physical distances to maintain between persons within the premises of the Renaissance Club North Berwick for a period of the Scottish Open in July. The Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions and Requirements Local Level Scotland Amendment number 32, Regulations 2021, SSI 2021-263, came into force on the 19th of July and include reduced physical distancing to 1 metre indoors and outdoors. And finally, Presiding Officer, the Health Protection Coronavirus Requirement Scotland Regulation 2021, SSI 2021-277, came into force on the 9th of August. It included the requirement for relevant hospitality and entertainment premises to obtain a record visitor information. And that is that, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on these motions will be put at decision time. There are 3 questions to be put as a result. Point of order, Neil Bibby.
The First Minister accused a number of members of this chamber of using data on Test and Protect in a misleading manner. She accused members of talking down the performance of Test and Protect and proceeded to share her wisdom with the chamber on the accuracy of provisional figures. The First Minister, then using provisional figures, appeared to suggest performance was within the WHO standards. It's a case of do as I say, not as I do, Presiding Officer, and it gives a misleading impression of test and protect performance by the test the First Minister herself set for others. The First Minister was given the opportunity to clarify her remarks by my colleague Paul O'Kane. She didn't. She encouraged members to look in detail at the figures. I have. Data published only this afternoon by Public Health Scotland makes clear that only 60.5% of contact tracing was completed within the target 72 hours, well below the WHO standard. These are finalised figures, Presiding Officer. The First Minister herself stressed the importance of accuracy. Presiding Officer, I know you want colleagues to treat each other with respect. That applies to the First Minister too. Out of respect for colleagues, should the First Minister apologise to the Chamber for suggesting figures were being used in a misleading way by members of this Chamber, and will the First Minister be asked to clarify the record at the earliest opportunity?
I thank the member for advance notice of his point of order. The content of members' contributions is not a matter for me. However, the member's point is now on the record. And if any member realises that he or she has given incorrect information in a contribution in the Chamber, there is a procedure for addressing this via the official report. Now, there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I propose to ask a single question on 7 Parliamentary Bureau motions, and if any member objects, please say so now. Yes. Thank you. Can I ask to which motion the member objects?
Motion 1120, Presiding Officer.
Mr Kerr, can I confirm?
Yes, 1120 as well.
Thank you. In that case, I will put the others on block and take that question separately. So the first question is that motions 1113, 1114, 1115 and 1117 to 1119 in the name of George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, on approval of SSIs be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 1120 in the name of George Adam, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, on approval of SSIs be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote and there will be a short suspension. The question is that motion 1120 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on approval of an SSI be agreed. Members may cast their votes now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on motion 1120 in the name of George Adam is yes 67, no 25. There were 24 abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 1121 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on committee membership be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed. The final question is that motion 1122 in the name of George Adam on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau on substitution on committees be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed, and that concludes decision time, and we'll now move to members' business, and I would be grateful if members leaving the chamber could do so quietly.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.